Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Savior King, the Master Tactician and the Queen of Liberation in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 91, Interlude. The mechanized alarms of Shamhala were some of the worst noises to ever assault Michael's ears. You'd think being 90% dead would blunt their murderous effects, but you'd be so very wrong. The longer they went on, the more he wanted to carve his own ears off. He bemusedly wondered after a while if that compulsion could actually grow strong enough to break through the geese. Wouldn't that be amusing, if you tilted your head and squinted a bit? Finally, Achilles murmured, rising from the box he'd been sitting on. He's still a giant compared to the rest of them, like a mountain come to life. Even this miserable undeath couldn't diminish that. He unloaded the second free kugel off his back and walked over to Michael's side, patting him gently on the shoulder. I was starting to worry they wouldn't come. You're still so bloody impatient, Julius said with an affectionate eye roll. The slender mortal savant always looked tiny and fragile whenever he stood next to Achilles, even though nothing could be further from the truth. They made very good time to be here already. Michael nodded silently in agreement, looking down at his feet and feeling more tired than he had in a long time. He'd much rather sit right here, wait for one of Vishnu's siblings to find him, and accept what's been long overdue. Error. He gritted his teeth in pain. He knows that if he continues to resist, his muscles will start to move against his will, but why not spite the monsters that dragged him from his grave as much as possible, even if it's futile? He hated them, the Agarthans. He hated all of them so much, more even than the cannibalistic cult that devoured his parents in front of him, and the reason for that is clutched tightly in his hands. The lance glowed in the low light of the barracks. It still hurt to look at it, felt colder than ice when he held it in his hands. It still made him want to scream, to make a futile attempt to impale himself on its blade as he should have the instant he had realized who it was. Watch out, Michael, it's still coming for you. I noticed, Simon. He yelled over his shoulder, barely managing to throw himself behind a rock formation in time to avoid the river of corrosive poison the massive demonic beast breaths like a jet of flame. The blonde didn't dare stop moving. He rolled forward several times before scrambling to his feet. Behind him, the rocks melted in seconds under the beast's assault, the toxic miasma spilling onto the ground in his wake. Michael glanced over his shoulder and swore bitterly, because despite having a lance buried in its front left leg, magical burns covering its spiny scaled hide, and 24 arrows stuck in its hide, including one in one of its eyes, the grey lizard-esque beast hasn't so much as slowed down. All of that punishment had only broken one of its magical barriers and weakened another. Ren, where are you? He yelled frantically, trying to regain his bearings. Ahead of you, don't stop running. Ren shouted from somewhere up ahead. Simon, where the fuck did you get to? I'm over by the river. Maybe we can drown it. Their purple-haired friend called out somewhere to his right. Michael immediately banks hard, narrowly avoiding the clawed paw that would have taken his head off if he'd been a split second slower. How exactly are we supposed to force its head underwater long enough for it to have any effect? Ren demanded. If you have any better ideas, I'm open to them. Simon yelled back in exasperation. Michael burst out onto the bank of the river and sees both Simon and Angel there, tense as rabbits and magic glowing around their hands. We'll just have to keep knocking it down. With what? Michael shouted back in a panic as the demon bursts after him. He wishes for dear life that Achilles and Renato were here, or at least Gabriel. He knows he's not much of a strategist, and his usual strategy is to hit his opponents until they stop moving. Not exactly applicable here. Ultimately, demonic beasts did go down if you hit them enough times, but staying alive until you got through their magical protection and their scales and their absurdly tough skin and bones, These monsters had killed far tougher than him for decades now. The monsters had existed since the breaking of the world, and so many had said that it's only a matter of time before they devour what remains of humanity. Michael remembered the first time he'd heard that, two cultists discussing it over the bones of his mother. His will to survive redoubled, and he furiously waves at his friends to get out of the way. Angel immediately grabbed Simon's arm and cast warp, switching them both over to the far bank of the river. Michael spun around and threw his lance directly at the charging monster's face, aiming for its mouth. It slams past its teeth and into the creature's tongue, causing it to screech in pain. Taking that moment to move, Michael turned back to the river and jumped in, pulling himself up out of the current and onto one of the few rocks jutting up from the surface. Balancing precariously, Michael jumped to the next and turns around, drawing the magic-charged sword that Ronan had given him just a week ago. He prays that he isn't about to break it. He'd hate to lose a gift from him so soon. The giant demonic beast snarled and lunges into the water after him. The wave that it displaces is blasted apart by Angel, clearing the way for Simon to throw powerful light spells over Michael's head at the beast. Back on the other beach, Ren has scaled a tree and was frantically firing arrows at the creature's back as it crawled towards Michael, forcing him to jump back onto another stone. His foot slipped. Michael doesn't notice in time. His body falls out from underneath him and his head slams into the stone. His vision goes blurry, and his friend's screaming for him sounds like it's coming from very far away. Instinctively he throws the lightning blade at the shore so he won't be killed by the resulting electrocution. Grabbing blindly at the stone he'd fallen from, Michael lifted his head up above the water, coughing to clear his lungs. Purple strains of water drip down on the water on either side of him, sizzling and making the liquid boil. The blonde looks up to see the beast hovering directly above him, jaws wide open. Michael just blinked, his mind getting stuck. He'd been so close to death so many times it no longer felt frightening, just strangely serene. "I'm sorry." A lance of green light whipped across the air and struck the monster in the head. Rather than be stopped, it ripped straight through the skull that had taken so many of their attacks like a hot knife through grass. The creature was decapitated in one hit. The monster's body reels backwards, away from Michael, and shatters into dust. The blonde could only blink owlishly, his head aching from the impact. "Am I hallucinating?" he wondered somewhat fuzzily. No, he can hear his friends stuttering. They must have seen it too. A pair of nice boots land on the rock a bit to the right, then jump to a stone near him. "That was a close one," a warm voice said, cutting through the fog in his mind. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner, can you hear me?" Michael blinked and looks up. A tall, gorgeous angel is perched on the rock next to him. Spiky green hair frames a pale, angular face with bright, emerald gold eyes. He's dressed in a hunter's long coat and dark, well-made pants. He's filled out and healthy and dressed well, unlike almost anyone Michael had ever met. He wears a warm smile as he offers him a slender, calloused hand. Michael couldn't speak for several seconds, his breath was stolen right out of his lungs. He felt his mouth move uselessly for a few seconds. "Lord, you could have warned me," he stammered out after a second. The second he said the words, he wanted to kick himself and scrambles for a way to retract them, but the angel just laughed warmly in response. "Ha ha, I probably should have. Sorry." He accepts Michael's shaky hands and lifted him right out of the river as though he weighed nothing. "That looks pretty nasty. Can any of you heal?" Michael's thoughts were a little fuzzy, but the next thing he knew, he's lying comfortably on the grass with Angel casting Recover on him. Simon and Ren were kneeling near him, intense relief on their face. The pain leaving his head, Michael sat up and looked around frantically, wondering if the angel had vanished like a mirage. No. He was standing off to the side, smiling, his hands on his hips. "Who are you?" Michael asked shakily, standing up slowly as a bemused and somewhat indignant Ren tries to get his attention. The green-haired angel smiled. "Vishnu. It's nice to meet you." Michael. Michael blinked slowly, coming back to the present as Achilles shook his shoulder. The broad-shouldered warrior gives him a gentle look that might seem strange on his otherwise rugged, thuggish figure if you didn't know him well. "My friend, your body is about to start moving on autopilot. Come, we have to go." "NGH. I know," Michael muttered helplessly, forcing himself to his feet and clutching Vishnu's bones tightly. Before, Achilles would have made a joke and lifted everyone's spirit with his boisterous laugh. Now, however, he just nodded sympathetically and kindly pretends not to notice the stray, murky tears dripping down his friend's cheeks. They start walking down the hard, cold hallways. Michael listened for any sound of battle as they made their way down the winding halls, and feels his lip quirk in bemusement when no sign that anything was amiss reached his ears. He wondered if the civilians on this floor had even been told that they were in danger. "Do you want me to confront your boy on the battlefield?" Julius asked in a low voice as they approached the elevator. "I'm willing to fight him in your place." "Thank you, But I want to talk to him, Michael confessed, thinking back to that day in the forest. That boy with blue eyes and blonde hair, wide with shock and horror and dismay as he stares at him. His grandson, after many generations, like Ren's descendant had said, son was easier to say. He was stalwart and bold and fiercer on the field than Michael himself had ever been. He wants to tell that boy how amazing he was, how he has surpassed Michael himself, how sorry he was for leaving him with the legacy he had. It might be a bit premature to assume we're going to get to fight anyone other than the Nabateans, Achilles observed. Michael couldn't help but agree, if Mikhail had reappeared as well, surely he'd go straight for them. When have we ever gotten that lucky? Julius muttered dismally, shoving his hands in his pockets. Michael stepped into the elevator and gives his once red-haired friend a completely incredulous look. You think facing the siblings of the ones we devoured is us getting lucky? He asked weakly. Julius shook his head violently, his long grayed hair falling around his face as he shakes with anger and regret. Do you know how Myson mutilated my beautiful granddaughter and stripped decades off of her life as a test to later empower that miserable wretch, Hresvelg? He demanded, his voice shaking with anguish. He had been the best father out of all of them, the most attentive and openly loving. Most of them had struggled. Right now, Michael, nothing could make me angrier than being forced to cause her any more harm. Michael's eyes widened. When Angel told me, Julius said bitterly. She finished the wretch's preparations, and heard Myson say a few things. Michael and Achilles looked helplessly at each other, searching for words that might provide what little comfort for their friend that they could find. But they're cut off by the elevator doors sliding open, revealing the rest of their friends. You're late, Ren teased them, smiling softly. He still isn't sure how his friend manages that, even now. Michael tried to smile back, but couldn't force his way through the familiar freezing veil of his despair. A heavy arm crashed over his shoulders, nearly causing him to fall over while wrapping him in warmth. He gave Achilles a look of faint protest. Blame Myson, Julius grumbled sourly. He walked over to Elizabeth and gently clasps her hand. Their wedding rings were missing, probably stolen by the men who resurrected them. What was one more indignity at this point? Where's the wretch? She's being sent up first. To soften up the Nabateans for us. Elizabeth bit out unhappily, her fingers drumming violently against the shaft of her bone spear. Maurice is here. Everyone stiffened at that. Michael's stomach churned with a familiar mixture of grief and regret. I swear, if you make one more puppy joke in my general direction, Ren, I'm going to drown you in the middle of the night. Maurice yelled warningly, chucking a chicken bone across the table. The archer laughs and dodges, watching in amusement as Elizabeth grabbed Maurice's collar and chides him for making a mess at the table. Don't mistake his intentions, Maurice. Achilles said warmly. We're incredibly happy for you, you know that right? Gad, you're all so embarrassing. I haven't even asked Alyssa to join us permanently yet because I'm afraid she'll catch the lot of you spying on us from some cliffside. Maurice complained. He tries to squirm free of Elizabeth's grip to no avail. Thank the heavens, Simon Gloucester said after a painfully long silence. At the various outraged and confused looks his family bombards him with, he quietly elaborates, at least we'll have a chance to set him free from that living hell. I guess we've got to find our silver linings where we can while we still can, huh? Jason Dominic mused, stroking the neck of his faithful wyvern steed which had been reborn alongside him into this nightmare. Rayleigh lowered his head and nuzzled his hair, a ragged chirrup sounding as if to soothe him. Do you suppose the goddess herself will come out to greet us? I have no doubt she wants to, but she should save her strength for the javelins. Griffith said, his brow furrowing as he considered what few options they had. You think he's going to use them? Without any way to save the world he wants to rule? Elizabeth asked in response, though her tone was almost perfunctory. Michael grimaced at the sign that he wasn't the only one who suspected that those weapons would be activated one way or another. I think that man is determined not to lose, just like Hresvelg. No matter what form winning would take. Griffith said dryly. Only the darkness in his eyes showed just how much contempt he had for the pair because of that. We should spread out, Renata stated. Her hands flex repeatedly as she thinks a mile a minute, seeking out the vanishing loopholes in their orders. Use our strength to break lines, rather than charging down the middle and being inevitably met by all four Nabateans. Find shadows to cling to and strike out at weak links. You know, to damage morale. Jason let out a rattling laugh at that. You're still a scary fucking witch, Rena. It's a decent enough way to give them a chance to dogpile us separately. His expression grew more serious. Do you think they can beat us? They're fighting for their very world and their future, the same way we were back then, Renata responded firmly. Yes, I think they can. Michael closed his eyes. I hope so. I really hope so. He ran through the winding streets of the elegant, well-built town, cursing himself for not having done this sooner. The garden drew closer by every second. He prays that Vishnu will still be there. He has to leave at sunrise tomorrow, and that knowledge guides his feet around a few corners and out onto a patio right before the wide, gated garden. Much to his relief, Michael instantly saw a familiar flash of light green gold hair at the foot of one of the apple trees. Vishnu! He called out, nearly crashing bodily into the gate in his haste. He still hit his knee and curses in pain, fumbling with the gate lock. The tall man whipped around, yanking a small branch off the tree and causing a dozen or so overripe fruit to rain down on him. Vishnu flailed slightly, brushing the fallen leaves and fruit aside before jogging over to the gate. Michael, he said in surprise, unlatching the gate and letting him in. What are you doing out so late? You really should be sleeping. Julius's territory is no small distance. I had to talk to you, Michael confessed, looking up into those mesmerizing green gold eyes. Vishnu blinked rapidly at him. So urgently? Has something happened? I did promise to see you off tomorrow, didn't I? Yes, I know, but, I should have asked this long ago, but I was entirely self-conscious. Michael hated how much he's stuttering, but he can't seem to stop himself. Yesterday, I clearly said something that upset you quite a bit, and I'm not sure what it was. I don't know how to apologize for it. Sure enough, there's a brief flicker of something in Vishnu's eyes. Was it grief? Michael was familiar with that emotion, but what had he said to trigger that? He tries hard to remember, has been going over that conversation in his mind repeatedly, but all he recalls is a conversation about a dragon that had been hunted and killed. He's missing something, he knows it, and he hopes that this will get cleared up. Oh, that, Vishnu said a little hesitantly. It. He looked like he was on the verge of saying something, only to hurriedly change his mind. I was a little sensitive, I admit. That dragon, it met such a cruel fate, it bothered me how callously you spoke about his demise. I'm sorry, Michael responded earnestly. I suppose I've been surrounded by death for so long that it has lost all meaning to me. In all honesty, any horror and fear of death had been seared out of him after his mother and father had been slaughtered and devoured. It still amazes me, how much you hold precious even the smallest of creatures. Even someone like me. Vishnu tilts his head, his eyes widening slightly, and he grabs his hand. Michael swears his face catches fire. What do you mean, even you? He asks, emotion leaking into his voice. Yes, you've done regrettable things, but your choices were shaped by the world you lived in. My heart aches when I think about how much you've suffered. You're too kind. I wish you weren't so overwhelmed by such basic displays of compassion. There's nothing basic about what you do to me, Michael says, then stalls in a panic. He hadn't meant to say that out loud. Vishnu stares at him for a second and then gives him one of those achingly dangerous smiles. He reaches up and strokes stray strands of blonde hair away from his face. Michael freezes under the touch, feeling his heart racing in his chest. It's strange that you'd say something like that, the green-haired mystery said playfully, stepping close enough that Michael can feel his breath on his lips. Whenever you smile, truly smile, I feel like the world tilts underneath my feet. Michael's knees buckle, his hands instinctively grabbing Vishnu's shoulders to steady himself. Their lips met in the dying light of day, and nothing in his life had ever felt so happy. Michael was jerked from his memory by the pulsing of the geese, which forces one foot in front of the other as he follows the rest of his family through the tunnel toward the elevator from the 5th floor toward their children and their armies. He looked down at Vishnu's bones, glowing in his hands, and wished he could throw up, or use the all-piercing power to bring down the ceiling on top of Thales, bury this horror forever. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't know. He remembered choking on the words, screaming them to the heavens, trying to cut his wrists and trying to slaughter the Agarthan doctors, but being stopped by Ronan. By Nemesis. You would spill his blood carelessly? Michael set his jaw. There's nothing careless about the spilling of blood that I plan to see through today, Father. If we can succeed, somehow, some way, you'll never rise from your cradle. Chapter 92. Atra, how close are we to the nearest override panels? Dmitri shouted over the general chaos of the battle, activating atrocity with a thought. He swings Eridbar once over his head and flings it directly into the main chest area of the Titaness, blocking off the alleyway they were trying to proceed through. The impact causes a truly ungodly screeching noise. Dmitri was familiar with the sound of metal being pushed beyond its limits, but the sheer scale of the body of a Titaness amplified it 100 times over, and mixed with the sound of rock crumbling and fire snapping and crackling, to boot. Eridbar's impact carved a huge hole right through the place where the Titaness's metal heart was. Silently Dmitri thanked Claude for the archery lessons he had given him. It had given him a much stronger eye for accuracy than he'd ever had before. The glowing lines along the length of the Titan's body flicker weakly before going out, and it sank down on one knee before falling to its side. He hadn't thrown his primary without regard for the various enemies on the rooftops and charging down the street toward him. Yuri dropped the Aubin Crest's glamour in time, revealing himself on the west rooftop as he stabs an Agarthan sniper through the shoulder. He then drops the man to the ground, kicking his bow off the roof and cauterizing his wound with Nosferatu, saving his life but taking him out of the fight. The altered brave bow is caught by Atra, who tosses it over to Claude's cousin Aisling without missing a beat. The Almiran princess cheerfully thanks her in her first tongue before drawing 2 arrows and shooting down the fortress knight that was flinging little black stones at the group. In response, Seath/Sikal hit 1 foot against the ground. Several pillars of stone burst out of the ground, tossing those rocks in the air where they exploded with incredible force and flames. We're getting close. Atra reassured him with steely determination in her voice. She drew her flame sword and darts forward, blocking 2 blows from a sword master before unleashing the altered form of Astra that Glenn had helped her master. Its placement is a bit unintuitive. It's hidden at the end of a dead-end street and underneath the ventilation system. I've memorized the floor plan, so I'm sure of it. She climbed the broken body of the Titaness, expertly jumping over the molten bits of metal that would have burned her to the bone right through her light body armor otherwise until she can grab the hilt of Eridbar. Wincing in worry, she quickly wrenches it free and spins on one heel to toss it back to him. Dmitri grabbed Vishnu's bones out of the air with practiced ease, pivoting on 1 foot to block a blow from an incoming lance knight. He reached up past the weapon he'd pushed aside and grabbed the man's arm. He briefly sees his opponent's eyes widen behind his visor before he bodily yanks the man right off his mount, tossing him down to the floor. I'm sorry. I'm not here to fight you, he said sternly before knocking the knight out with a carefully controlled kick. I can respect that they haven't all fled for their houses upon seeing Indek and Mikul transformed. Aisling said with a sort of cheeriness that Dmitri recognized as distinctly Almiran, but still found a little off-putting. She turned her bow to the side and shot down a horse that came charging out of a dead-end street, causing it to throw its rider into a steel wall. I almost wish I could just sit and watch those magnificent brothers work. You'll get a chance, I'm sure, Dmitri said wryly. Seath gives Aisling a somewhat strange look. He's either bemused or a little uncertain of the sort of starry-eyed awe the teenager is favoring his elder brother with. The young king can hear both of the saints at work, sound echoed in the contained chambers of Shamhala. Dmitri could feel the faint breezes kicked up by Mikul's wind storms on his face, even on the opposite side of the floor from the dragon. In his peripheral vision, he can see the falcon dragon circling around the ceiling before diving down and unleashing a wind blade so strong it's visible, crackling with green magic. A ways away from him, Indeka's odd shell wings are spread open, walls of water periodically bursting up from the ground to ward off familiar spear blasts of magic from the ceiling and blades of red light from other Titaness. Seeing that eased the worry in his heart, being so far away from Byleth and Claude. He knows that they're either near one of those two, or with Sirios, and that meant they were as safe as they could be given the circumstances. Still, he desperately needs to get back to them, and he resists the urge to rush in hopes of getting back across the floor as quickly as humanly possible. Or, half-dragon possible. Dmitri was morbidly curious on how to define his physicality with the knowledge that he inherited Vishnu's stolen blood. He wondered if the thought was bothering any of his friends as well. Climbing over the downed Titaness, Dmitri glances at Aisling as the spirited Almiran girl jumped to the ground ahead of him. She doesn't look a lot like Claude at first glance. Her hair is raven black, her skin a shade or two darker, and her body built subtly differently. However, a closer look at her face revealed her ties to her cousin. Her eyes are the same bright emerald green, and the shape of cheeks and her smile is identical as well. She's dressed similarly to Nader, who apparently adopted her after the executions of her brother and uncle. There's 2 axes at her sides beneath her bow and quiver. Apparently her wyvern wasn't quite disciplined enough to be willing or able to follow her deep underground, not that her companion's absence was slowing her down too much. Aisling shot down another sniper the moment her feet hit the floor. Then she spins around and offers him a playful smile along with her hand. He smiled back and accepts it, making the hard leap down to the stone floor. "Don't worry so much, Anaki," she chided him. "Nachan and Ni-san are even scarier than Uncle Kira." "I know, but it's only because I worry that I've survived this long," Dmitri defended himself before he charged the 2 armored knights ahead of him. They've crossed closer to the point that Atra had laid out for them. It's not as heavily guarded as he expected. Very strange, though perhaps Thales and his commanders hadn't expected them to exploit the advanced mechanics of the city. They probably don't believe we're smart enough to know how to exploit them, even with Atra and Lucy's help, Dmitri thought sourly. A savage smile crosses his face as Eridbar crashed through one man's shield like it was made of paper. More fool they. He slugs the fortress knight in the face, his gauntlet bends slightly, but the blow rocks the Agarthan's world, knocking him backward. Yuri appears out of the ether again and hits the other knight in the back with aura. Seath blew past Dmitri to slash through the remains of the man's armor with the spear of Assel. Dmitri delivered a knockout blow with the flat side of Eridbar's blade before running past the fallen fortress knight. He catches up with Atra seconds later. She's gotten surrounded by 3 swords master. Aisling shoots one of them in the upper back, paralyzing his shoulder and causing him to stagger. Atra blocks with her silver blade and swings her custom fire sword in a wide arc, sending a burst of flames that forces the other 2 to back up. Dmitri skidded to a halt a few feet away and kicks one woman's legs out from underneath her. Yuri pivoted quickly and casts Nosferatu on the third, healing himself of the minor injuries he'd gained along the way and giving Atra the room she needed to take out her tormentor. The black-haired girl uttered a sigh of relief, brushing loose strands of her hair away from her face before smiling at them. "Thank you," she said in relief. Then she turned around and points her fire sword down the street. "It's right over there." Dmitri followed the point and took in the scenery, shifting his grip on his lance. The road is quite wide, and rows of what, by Shamhala's standards, he'd learned were the houses of lower-ranked families rising on either side of it. If he squinted, he could see frightened figures peering through the glass windows of the buildings. He wonders if any of the children Emil cared for lived on this floor, or if their families were lower down. Of course, more immediately important is there are a dozen or so soldiers waiting for them, a couple of swordsmen, men with gauntlets and axes, a couple of mages. Still not nearly enough to form a decent defense. Is Thales waiting for something? Where are the Einherjar? Where is Nemesis? You would think there would be better defenses by the residential districts, Seath said in disappointment before holding out one hand. Dmitri almost cringed in sympathy when the group of soldiers, who had started to run toward them, were sent flying by a dozen stone spikes burst up from the ground. "You never used that power during the siege of Gareg Mach?" Dmitri asked curiously as they start to jog down the street, Atra leading the way. Yuri briefly vanished once again. "Why was that? Does it have something to do with the injuries you sustained during the final battle of the war against Nemesis?" "You are correct," Seath acknowledged. They approach the monolithic grey wall. Lines of pipes and square vents crisis cross its length, looking like a bizarre massive spiderweb to Dmitri's eyes. He can see the strange glow that he's coming to associate with the Agartha and Magitek pulsing through the pipes as they draw close. "I sustained a number of internal injuries that specifically affected my ability to transform. I suspect I had been deliberately targeted that way," and Seth leaned to. "Your daughter can transform too?" "Theoretically, at least." Atra asked curiously as she approaches the wall, walking up to a thick pipe underneath the air vent and touching a button. A large rectangular section of the wall falls inward and then flips over, revealing a glowing panel with buttons and a small screen. I had thought for some reason that having a human mother might have rendered her too fragile for such a transformation. No, it's not quite so, Seath said. Her form was smaller than mine or my siblings, but she had no less power for it. Unfortunately, she hasn't been able to access it since she woke up, and in the meantime I had simply resigned myself to living without it. He flexes his hand. My mother attempted to help me before we left, and some of my abilities have been coming back. Perhaps in time my full form will return as well. Further conversation was interrupted when Yuri reappeared with Lucy in tow. The renegade doctor looked a little queasy from the rough teleportation, but she regains her wits admirably quickly. Thank you, she gasped out before walking on slightly wobbly legs to Atra's side. She draws a card from one of her pockets and slides it through the terminal, causing it to briefly change colors before making a strange sound. Atra sighed in relief. Good, they haven't cut your access. That makes life much easier. She hits a number of buttons, then twists a knob. The words, "Override initiated," flicker across the screen before it turns red. A weird siren noise echoed across the floor, ringing 4 times before falling silent. Now the elevator will be open to us despite attempts to lock us out. By Suthies, that noise is atrocious. Dmitri grumbled as he turned toward Yuri. What even creates something such a sound? Well, its job is to get your attention and inform you that something has happened, Atra responded wryly. Hence why it's made to be hard to ignore. The emergency alarms are artificial sounds, I promise. No living creature can make sounds like that regardless of what you do to them. Not even the demonic beasts. The fact that Lucy felt the need to reassure him in that capacity spoke leagues of what she must expect from her former overlords. Dmitri isn't sure if he's appalled, or just feels pity for her. Was he finally becoming numb to the atrocities of the sunken city? At least Byleth will know we've succeeded, Dmitri said decisively. Let's get back to the main army. Atra, the warp station. As you say. Yuri, help me please. For you? Always, Yuri said, and Dmitri can hear an inflection of emotion beneath his usual teasing tone that clearly flies right over Atra's head. Judging by the wolf's mildly exasperated look as the group forms a circle around the swordswoman, he wasn't the only one. He'd been warped enough times by now that it no longer makes him want to hurl. Aisling, by comparison, clearly didn't have the same experience. She wheezed miserably as they reappeared in front of the field hospital. Mercedes and Dorothea were manning, doubling over as she fought not to throw up. Are we going to be doing a lot more of that? The teenage Almiran asked plaintively. Probably, Atra said matter-of-factly. Feel free to sit down for a few minutes, I doubt this floor has much resistance left to offer. Aisling uttered another miserable sound in response and dropped into a nearby chair. A kingdom knight walked over to her, offering her a bundle of arrows to refill her quiver. She thanked him in her own language and it didn't even earn an odd look from the older man. Dmitri resisted the urge to smile gladly at the interaction, instead turning and running back to the battlefield along with the others. The main streets, as he hesitates to call them, are in a state of controlled chaos. Dmitri noticed a lot of beaten down and tied up Agarthan soldiers. He'd expected his men to be short on mercy, and is inordinately proud to see some of their opponents being spared. That isn't to say there aren't a lot of corpses strewn all about. There are, mixed in with the broken, molten ruins of various titans. Suthies, there were so many of them. How many of those metal and magic monoliths did Thales have to call on? Atra runs toward the descending form of Makul, guessing that Byleth and Claude were over there. Dmitri keeps up, noting that Indek was approaching his brother as well. Maurice is deeper in the city, dealing with the last few titans. Thankfully doing so would sate his monster body's bloodlust, so he wouldn't lose control and attack the army or the civilians in the meantime. Either way, Marianne, Glenn, Sylvain, and Ingrid, all equipped with either sacred or bone weapons, were there with him as both assistance and insurance. It was his idea, apparently. Dmitri felt a strange and sad sense of kinship to the ancient man, then pushes it down with a force of effort. He needed to get back to his fiancées. Here's your answer. Byleth's fearless declaration guided him down a road in a right corner, Dmitri emerges from the dark in time to see her drop Suthi's sword to her side and point one hand at a fortress knight. Moments later, a massive flare of white magic, aura, she had learned aura, when had that happened? Consumed the man and horse both, blasting them into ashes. Claude stood on the rooftop behind her, firing arrows from fail not at a pair of tall, black metal magitech spires. The magic arrows slam into the constructs with an ear-rattling crashing sound, like the shattering glass and melting metal at the same time. Dmitri winced, but when the lights went out, the sound of the ceiling ballistics abruptly sputtered out. Ah, those must be the power sources for this floor's version of Viscom. A great cheer goes up from their army. Byleth raised the glowing blade forged from the goddess's bones over her head, somehow taking this mutilation of Suthi's and turning it, genuinely, into a symbol of hope and victory. Whether it would stay that way when the historical records were restored, he sort of doubted, but he didn't doubt this memory would linger. The elevators are ours, Atra reported, darting up to Byleth and skidding to a halt. Dmitri is right at her heels, while Seath moves past them, gently grabbing his sister by the shoulders and looking her up and down in search of injury. We should be able to travel to the second floor without issue. Well, without technical issue anyway, she scowls. I think I got all the local cameras, so they shouldn't know that we're abusing the mechanics themselves, but that will just prompt Thales to get creative. At least we're building up a decent head of steam, Byleth responded as Claude jumped down to join them. The longer they're panicking and in complete disorder, the better. Seath tilted her chin up and she uttered a slightly exasperated laugh, pushing his hand away. I'm fine, I promise. Felix, Bernie, and the others ensured that no one even got close to me. Not for your lack of trying, Felix said grumpily. He and Bernadetta emerged from around a corner, looking a little scuffed and sooty with significant tears and burns on various parts of their clothes. However, neither of them look injured. You keep charging straight ahead. She isn't, though, at least, not really. Bernadetta contradicts her fiancé awkwardly, glancing up at the sky. This whole time we've just been keeping pace with the Nabateans. Felix grumbled something imperceptible before scowling at Dmitri. And you? I half expected you to show up with a spear still lodged in your arm. He tried to say it like the thought annoyed him, but there's a look in his eyes that Dmitri had missed so much since that battle after the tragedy. Worry and concern. I promise, I'm fine. Yuri kept us all healthy and fighting sensibly. Dmitri tried to assure him. He can feel a silly smile cross his face. Felix scowled and hurriedly looked elsewhere in response. Bernadetta's eyes sparkled at the interaction and hugs his arm affectionately. Felix made no attempt to shake her off despite grumbling traitor in a flustered tone of voice. Mikhail circled overhead a few times before dropping rapidly. Dmitri winced, half expecting a harsh impact as he's swallowed by the dragon's shadow briefly before he transforms into his human form. Landing lightly on his feet, Mikhail irritably pulled his hood down and surveyed the group before him. All the Titanists are down, and the army is mopping up what few pockets of resistance are left. He said coolly. If you're going to attempt to sway the people of Shamhala now, I won't stop you, but bear in mind that Thales will make use of every moment we provide him. I know, but we have to open a dialogue here. Atra said entreatingly before Byleth or Claude, both of whom looked contemplative, could respond. Thales taught us to resist to our last breath, to attack even if it meant throwing our lives away. If that will he imposed upon us is riled up while the army proceeds down, they can attack us from behind and cut off our exit route from the city. Getting the floors as stable as possible is crucial to ensure we'll never have to split our forces up, considering we haven't seen hide or hair of the Ain-Herjar yet. Mikhail frowned for a painfully long second, before blowing out a tired breath. Reasonable, he admitted curtly. But still, you need to make it fast. He started to walk off back the way they came, the sounds of battle dying down as he headed in the direction Sirios had last been seen. He's a storm. Claude said with a shake of his head. Harsh and unpredictable. I doubt being down here is doing much for his mood, but still. He knows you're right, Atra, Index said from behind them, his dragon voice rumbling like a wave crashing against the surf. Byleth and Dmitri turned toward him as he transforms back, smiling reassuringly at the both of them when he sees them. His light green eyes follow his brother in concern until he disappeared around a corner. He just doesn't want to acknowledge it, He's been stewing in his anger and grief for a very long time, and he's desperate for this to be over, even if he doesn't look it on the outside. I don't envy him. Or Lady Sirios, Dmitri confessed. His memory goes back to the nights after the tragedy, the storm of burning flames that devoured him alive until Byleth and Claude found a way to dampen them to smoldering embers. I tried to live with the deaths of my father and my people for 4 years, and it nearly destroyed me. Trying to imagine not only living with it, but allowing the world to believe that no wrong had been done that day, he shook his head. It's incomprehensible. Well, going off some of my sister's choices, doing so and trying to guide the human world wasn't the choice she should have made. I think she forgot we're closer to being human than we sometimes realize. Our long memories can work against us. Indek observed before putting a hand on his shoulder. Dmitri is warmed by the gesture. He briefly wondered if marrying Byleth made the saints and the goddess his in-laws, but pondering that caused his brain to grind to a halt and blank out. Suthies help me. He had a sneaking suspicion she'd laugh at his frantic thoughts. Not in a cruel way, but she'd definitely laugh. We should get the army together, Yuri said, before looking contemplative. Was it Sophie whose family lived on this floor, or Gabriel? Marion's grandmother lives on floor 3, that much I know. It's Sophie, Atra confirmed. I can find her father fairly soon using the census data, the others won't be too difficult either. Convincing the people to come out, she frowned for a moment. That will be more difficult, but I have a plan. Seeth, do you know where Mercedes and Marianne are? I'll be in need of their unique talents. Seeth blinked rapidly, then smiles faintly. I believe I can find them in a timely fashion. Where do you imagine greeting any of the civilians? By the west side of the city, that's the place that sustained the least damage. Atra responded concisely, turning on one heel. There's a few other people I'd like to have nearby. It's unfortunate that Emil couldn't come, but his healing does take priority. Come, let's hurry. Dmitri believed in what Atra and Claude had planned and hoped to achieve as he stands behind his fellow students, partly hidden by the shadow of a building. He couldn't help but feel anxious anyway, the memory of the tragedy, of the trap the Agarthan army had sprung on him and his people, makes him constantly scan the length of the floor and the wall. Trying to look for any shaded crook or slit that a mage or an archer could use to fatally catch them by surprise. Atra was speaking in her people's language, a mishmash of old Fodlanes and the language that had been spoken before the cataclysm. Something is amplifying her voice, either Dorothea or one of the many strange mechanics of the sunken city. Atra sounded calm and yet commanding. He wondered if Byleth had given her a few pointers on how to speak to a crowd, or if it was simply coming from the depths of her soul. So far, no one has left the relative security of the buildings to speak to them. Dmitri can just barely see through the various windows that the people of the underground were watching them like a flock of fearful, mistrustful owls. Atra wound down her opening remarks before turning around and gesturing slightly. Mercedes gently nudged her way between Ingrid and Yuri on the raven-haired girl's right, leading Sophie out by the hand. The child soldier is shivering slightly, clearly barely trusting the situation she's in and clinging to Mercedes for all she was worth. That got a reaction, specifically, from the house directly in front of them. Dmitri heard a rattle of something being either dropped or flung aside before the front door slides open with a metallic hiss, revealing an older man with the same chalk-white skin, albeit far less sunburned, heather brown hair and wide blue eyes as his daughter. Sophie! He cried out. Sophie, you're alive. I thought the poor man stuttered and nearly collapsed to his knees, staring at his child in disbelief. They said, you were. Daddy! Sophie shrieked. She instinctively pulled forward, toward him. Mercedes made no attempt to stop her, and the 12-year-old almost face-planted on the hard stone floor when the older girl released her wrist. Stumbling and tripping over her own feet, Sophie whipped around and stared wide-eyed at her surface friend. Mercedes smiled, and while Dmitri couldn't see from here, he's certain she made a go-on gesture. Sophie stared at her for a long moment, then she whirled and ran into her sobbing father's arms. He swept her up and hugged her like a stuffed animal, babbling with the sort of joy and relief that transcended language barriers. A moment later, another figure exited the house, a small boy, maybe 8 or 9 judging by his height. He stared at the surface people forming a line in front of him for a long moment, before darting over and joining in the hug with his sister. Dimitri's chest ached with sympathy and a little hope. "Daddy, I'm okay, really, but I've seen the strangest things. When you didn't come home they gave me a killed in action notice. I didn't realize the surfacers took prisoners. Did they do anything to you? They didn't threaten to cut you up?" "No Daddy, Merci would never have let them." "Merci? Her? That's Merci. She's the best big sister, and she's very kind and smart. She's a lot like Mama, really." Dimitri didn't understand much of the dialogue, only guessing due to the tone. The father started at something Sophie said, raising his head to stare at Mercedes. The little boy, her brother, seemed to be reassured by her appearance. He let go of her and stood up, walking a few feet toward Atra before his father grabbed him. Dimitri could feel his curious stare boring into them. "Why?" Sophie's father asked after a moment, in rather shaky but passable common tongue. "Why did you bring my daughter home?" "What do you want, Atra of the surface?" "Peace," Atra responded. "That's all any of us want, peace and happiness." "That's impossible," the man said automatically. "The surface, the great cataclysm," he gropes for words, occasionally stealing a glance at Mercedes and Byleth and Flane, "was removed from their history. It was only after Thales began his campaign to wipe them out that circumstances aligned to return the old tales to them." Atra's fingers flex, like she's trying to force down the urge to cross her arms or make some sort of vehement gesture. "There was no hatred for Shamhala on the surface, no plans to descend her to finish us off. They didn't even remember us." A number of windows opened up, all along the wall before them. Dimitri looked up to see an old man stick his head out of one of those windows, shouting something in underground tongue in anger and disbelief. His son appeared at his side, trying to tug him back inside. "Thales is a man who lies so much he doesn't remember what the truth sounds like," Atra shouted, her voice booming with power and authority that silenced all the clamor from the windowsills. "They were not our enemies, not until we made them so. Would any of us accept the murders of our families and our children as a victory for humanity? Would we look at the mutilation of our children as something we should be grateful for? Would any of you?" A chilly, yet tangibly uncertain silence falls over the suspicious people looking out at them. Dimitri felt a strong desire to speak, to contribute, but he can't find the words he's looking for, although they feel as though they're sitting on the tip of his tongue. "If they were as savage and bloodthirsty as Thales said, would I still be alive?" Atra asked. Her tone is quieter, but no less vehement. Again, she's met with confused, unnerved quiet. Given that Lucy had told them she had been reported dead, the revelation they had been lied to had quite possibly left the citizens uncertain of what else they had been told that might be nonsense. Sophie tugged on her father and said something, fast and urgent and pleading. He looked down at her again, his body language screaming hesitation but also thoughtfulness. Slowly he stood up. "What do you want from us?" he asked clumsily, and Dimitri smiled when he realized the question is directed at Mercedes. Mercedes glanced at Atra and quietly asked her to translate for her, so there's no chance of her being misunderstood. The raven-haired girl nodded with a small smile. "I want to bring the children we captured home safely," Mercedes said after a moment. "I want this terrible conflict to end and for us to go home safely. So, for now, all I want is for you to not fight us. Please. I don't want to destroy you, none of my friends do. Stay in your homes and wait for the battle to be over, so we can find terms of peace that both of us consider acceptable." There's a pause after Atra finished translating, then a great rumble of discussion among those civilians. Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve again, while her brother made another attempt to approach Dimitri's fellow students only to sulk when he's denied again. "We won't harm any civilians," Mercedes added. "We're not Thales." Dimitri wondered if she was referring to the tragedy in Lysithia's fate with that statement, or to the Agarthan Council's fondness for dragging its own people away in the middle of the night and destroying them over insurrectionist tendencies. Sophie's father was torn, Dimitri could see it in his posture. Then he stood up, one arm still around his daughter's shoulders, and nodded. You brought my daughter home to me safe and sound. My children are my whole world. I'll abide by your wishes, for now. Thank you for for not harming her. She's a very sweet girl, I'm glad I met her. Mercedes responded with that perfect sweetness Dimitri had come to associate with her. Then she smiled at Sophie. I hope I'll get to see you later, Sophie. I hope so too, Sophie said seemingly without thinking about it. The other children, corralled between Yuri and Ingrid, looked at each other with fresh hope in their eyes. The first floor was secured, and so was a ray of hope for the future. I'm so relieved. Claude laughed as he, Byleth and the others walked toward Maurice and the elevators. He slung an arm around Mercedes's shoulders, causing her to stutter and laugh a little in surprise. I'll be honest, I was in a cold sweat the whole time, but it turned out even better than I hoped. I know I argued really hard to be included in that chat, but I think you were right in the end, Atra. Like I said, I hardly planned to bar you from talking to them at all, Atra complained, though the warmth in her eyes took any bite out of her words. The people here are going to be skittish at best. I need to set them at ease as much as I possibly can in order to ensure they go into negotiations with you and King Dimitri in good faith. I was expecting them to throw rotten food at us, Linhard admitted. We're doing much better than I thought we would. Well, they are pretty deeply in shock. This is the first enemy incursion into Shamhala in literally 1,000 years. Happy pointed out. The two of them were holding hands tightly, and Linhard was wearing a new set of light armor. They might get more belligerent when they recover from it. But we can change that if we reveal how much Thales has lied to them, can't we? Ash asked anxiously, clutching Parthia with widening knuckles. Begs the question if they'll be willing to believe it. Balthus said regretfully. Humans are pretty good at refusing to acknowledge things that make us unhappy. And telling someone that everything they thought they knew is a lie is going to be a hard sell. That's true, but people are good, in the bottom of their souls. Marianne protested. She's holding Ash's hand, her breathing coming out a little unevenly. Dimitri noticed with a hot spike of concern that the eerie shade of blue that signified the beast crest, Lien's crest, was faintly pulsing around her hands. It's all we can do, Ingrid sighed. Hope for the best and prepare for the worst, I said. Speaking of which, am I the only one uncomfortable rather than glad that we haven't seen any of our ancestors yet? Glenn blew out a tired breath. Definitely not, he said sourly. I doubt it's a good sign, it probably means that Thales has specific roles for them in Shamhala's defense. But why not just have them rush us? Leonie asked, tilting her head and frowning. And, what's the plan for if they do charge us as one unit? Pray to Suthies and fight like this is our last day alive, Felix said with more confidence than Dimitri felt they deserved for that hypothetical battle. His fingers tapped sharply on the hilt of Mercurius, no less ready for it than every precious encounter. And yell to the saints for help. Bernie tacked on with a nervous giggle. Byleth wordlessly turned toward Claude for help, their fiancé shrugged, a faint smirk on his face. Well, you know what they say, the best plans are the ones kept as simple as possible. I sincerely hope you're right. Dimitri muttered. He thought about the figure he'd clashed with on Brigid, the familiar face devoid of all life but for the flickering embers of the man who had once walked Fodlan. Suthies, guide us. He prayed as they reached Maurice and the towering steel doors of the elevator. I don't know if we're ready. Chapter 93. Marianne, are you going to be okay? The blue-haired priestess didn't look up at the question, she was kneeling on the floor of the elevator, wheezing, long strands of her hair falling loosely around her face. Her entire body was pulsing eerily with the light of Lien's crest. Claude swore that if he squinted, he could see the claws and scales poised to appear over her body like a twisted suit of armor. I can't, Marianne gasped out, her eyes squeezed shut. It's too strong, all the blood, it's singing to me. Ash looked terrified as he kneeled next to her, clutching her hand. He yipped when Morris's massive tail swept around the two of them, pressing them against his side. You are strong to have gone this long without shifting, the former human growled in a rare lucid moment. He'd been surprisingly coherent throughout the battle, from what Claude had heard, he'd never harmed any of their people. Maybe he'd been too busy gutting the dozens of Titanus that were all over the damned place. You're still human. You will come back from this. But, I attacked Lysathea, I attacked Ignatz, Marianne whimpered, clutching Ash's hand like a lifeline. I don't trust myself. Marianne, we'll be here with you. Byleth promised. We won't let you hurt any civilians. We won't let you hurt the army. If you can't stop this, then just know that we'll be safe, and that the rest of us will watch over you while you fight. Marianne looked up at them, and it was one of the saddest expressions Claude had ever seen. Her light aquamarine eyes were so wide, shimmering with tears, and it wasn't just fear in her eyes, there was also frustration and despair that she couldn't control herself here, of all places, at this critical time. Hey Mari, remember how I talked you down when you transformed way back when? Claude asked, reaching over and ruffling her hair. It disturbed her braids slightly, but the gesture seemed to give her comfort nonetheless. Barely. I don't remember much of when I change. She confessed quietly. I can still call you back. We can still call you back. Claude swallowed over the lump in his throat. Thinking about Marianne's transformed state, twisted and inhuman, gave him a horrible chill, juxtaposed against Maurice, titanic and ancient and so tired, it flooded him with anxiety. If you can't stop this, then when those doors open, let go. Marianne hesitated a moment longer. She turned her head to look at Ash, her fiancé looked pained, but leaned forward and gently kissed her on the lips. Just come back to me in the end, okay? He asked in a little voice. I'll try, Marianne gasped out. She slowly stood up, her legs still unsure despite how her hands trembled as she walked forward to stand just in front of Maurice. Claude grabbed Dimitri's hand and squeezed it gently, he can feel his fiancé's worry for her. Be prepared. Maurice growled, his nose twitching. Something approaches. It smells like us. Like us? Byleth demanded, glancing aside at Indek. The saint's eyes widened briefly, and his grip on the inexhaustible tightened until his knuckles went white. Are you talking about Nabatean's blood? Perhaps. It doesn't smell like my family, however. Maurice responded. Ash stood up in a hurry, scrambling over to Byleth's side as his tail twitched intently. The elevator dinged ominously, cutting off further conversation. Claude isn't able to ask him to elaborate before the door swing wide open. Marianne hurtled herself forward, she's barely a yard ahead of them before her body blazes with eerie blue light. Claude strung an arrow and shot down an enemy falcon knight that swooped down out of gracious nowhere to impale his friend as she transformed. He somewhat hysterically wondered how they managed to raise Pegasi and horses down here in the dark without them going mad. The transformation swept over Marianne like a shroud. In an instant, she rammed her blade tail through one warlock while her claws lashed out and slashed through the face of an archer that had been standing with him. The shimmering black scales, much sleeker than Morris's rugged old form by comparison, swept over her body as Marianne roared like one of the many monsters that had haunted Fodlan since the cataclysm. Maurice burst out of the storage elevator, thundering straight forward like an earthquake given legs. There was a tightness straight ahead down the road and, thanks to its size and bulk, it couldn't turn from the angle it had been facing, chasing McCule, before Maurice slammed bodily into it. Byleth shot out of the door next, swinging the sword of the Creator in a wide arc. Claude, Dimitri, and Ash run out behind her. In the corner of his vision, he could see their army pouring out of the stairwell and the other elevators still. They were a little behind the curve, since they'd held back a minute to check on Marianne as she shook in the thralls of her crest. McCule was flying overhead, sending arrows of wind magic down at various enemies on the second floor of Shamhala. Somehow, this damned city seemed smaller when we were looking at the floor plans back at the monastery, Khalid complained silently as he pivoted on one foot and shot down a sniper standing on a rooftop. Dimitri moved in front of him without missing a beat, blocking the sword of the approaching Agarthan soldier before knocking it aside and slugging the man in the face, sending him flying. Nice, Claude praised as Byleth cast aura at the fortress knight at the front of the street, that a couple of their people were struggling with. Morris's pounding blows as he tore open a titanus, gutting it of its heart with savage precision, almost drowned the words out. I take it those punching lessons you got from Raphael and Didu are starting to pay off. I never thought I'd have a moment to use hand-to-hand in battle, Dimitri admitted wryly as Ash picks off another falcon knight that was chasing Marianne. She had barreled past some of their troops, who let out startled noises, to breathe fire and poison on a very unfortunate swords master. He nudged the silver-haired boy, urging him to go ahead with her. Indek was sticking close to them, after all. Perhaps I'm a bit too inflexible for my own good. Ah, don't talk down to yourself, Mitya, Khalid bantered back affectionately, weaving around Indek as the former caused water to burst out of the sewer drain like a geyser, sending a dozen men flying like rag dolls. You usually never need anything beside your lance. I taught you the bow partly as an excuse to spend time with you, and partly to help you improve your visual targeting. Not because I thought you really needed it. Perhaps, but I have this tendency to end up dropping my lances for one reason or another during battle, Dmitri said as he grabbed a javelin and flung it with all his might. A mage that had been paying full attention to Byleth got skewered through the throat and died instantly. Having a pair of gauntlets at the ready would have perhaps been wise. Heads up. Indek warned them before pointing the inexhaustible straight upward. Like Fail Not, Artemis's bow, as Claude fully intended to rename it, magical arrows came into existence as he pulled the string back, then fired. A second later there was a crack as the blast of magic from Viskim struck the blessed bow's attack and dissipated in a dozen directions. I hope Atra and Yuri find that surge protector soon, Indek fretted, visibly tracking his brother in brief moments between covering Byleth. Mikul is going to get hit with the way he's flying around recklessly. They won't keep us waiting, Khalid tried to reassure him as he took a breath and summoned his crest power. A second later he shot the fallen star arrow, and watched as a dozen enemies died in half as many seconds. The army cheered and surged into the street, hurrying around the metal carcass of the Titaness. I bet they'll even find time to make out along the way. I rather hope so, Byleth grumbled as she led them down the road and further into the thick of battle. I'm worried that Atra won't realize that Yuri feels that way about her unless he does something spectacularly blunt, and he's used to being indirect. Is this the time to worry about such things? Indek asked, sounding like he couldn't decide if he was bemused or exasperated. Complaining about how oblivious our friends are helps to keep our heads clear, Khalid responded by way of explanation. There's a scream as he shot down another rooftop sniper, and it said a lot about both the war and the role of Agartha in it that he barely reacted to the terrible noise now. Gotta find the ways to lift your spirits where you can, yeah. Indek sort of shrugged as if to say, true enough, I suppose, but it's still weird to me, before taking point firing again. Maurice, Marianne, and Ash aren't far away, thankfully. They'd gone straight down the road had run into a pair of Titaness. As the four of them fought their way towards them, Felix, Bernadetta, Lysathea and Cyril all popped out of the two roads leading into the center square to assist them. As Byleth ran in their direction, Maurice slammed into the first Titaness, repeatedly beating its magical barrier until it broke, under 3 or 4 blows, as Felix scaled up his back. As the wandering beast grabbed one of the Titaness arm sockets in his jaw and began to wrench violently on it, Felix jumped up onto the metallic Titan's head and carved into its faceplate with Mercurius. He sliced deep grooves into it, Shiva's crest blazing until the headpiece broke right off, falling to the floor with a loud crash. While they were doing that, Marianne leapt up herself. Her claws rammed into the Titaness's metallic hide, each impact tearing into the magical shield as she climbed her way up its stomach. The Titan's massive blade was swung clumsily overhead. She was in such a position that it couldn't cut her down, it simply didn't have enough range of movement. Bernadetta and Lysthea scatter in different directions while Cyril jumped up onto the roofs of the house, agilely leaping between them as he took deliberately weak potshots to draw the Titaness's attention. As he did so, Lysathea, Ash and Bernadetta both took cover. Aiming with Seraphim, Parthia, and the briefly borrowed Taltham bow, they blew gaping holes in the arms and legs while Marianne continued her Colossus climb up to the head point. Marianne roared again, her hands blazing with the light of her crest as she unleashed a barrage of pounding punches on the head until she forced her way right through it, tearing it apart. Both machines sputtered and died. Felix scrambled from his suddenly crumbling mount to jump to a nearby rooftop. He nearly lost his footing on the edge, but Cyril grabbed his arm and dug his feet in, allowing him to regain his balance and step to safety as the machine fell to the ground with a crash. You guys are so fucking amazing, Claude laughed as they caught up just in time for the two metal monsters to be rendered irrelevant. Why was I worried? Because you can't help it, Lysathea sniffed haughtily. That didn't last as Marianne zipped off again, causing her to curse. I really wished she could be at least sensible enough to act on plans. Ash babbled out a relieved greeting to them before he ran after her. I wished she didn't lose herself at all, Byleth said unhappily. The white-haired girl slumped slightly at the reminder, before trotting close and putting a hand on her stomach. Bernadetta zipped forward and hugged Claude tightly. He took a moment to ruffle her hair. "How are the kids, Professor?" Lysithea asked in concern as Felix and Cyril climbed down from the roof they'd been on. "I heard that even stress alone is capable of causing a miscarriage. You haven't gotten hit near the stomach, have you?" "I promise, I've been well protected," Byleth said, her eyes glowing warmly. She leaned forward and kissed the top of Lysithea's head. She squeaked and blushed and furiously protested the childish gesture, despite how her whole soul lit up at the same time. "No, I haven't taken much of any damage, and I'm pretty calm and confident. Don't worry too much, okay? I'll stop worrying when the elites are returned to their graves and I've ripped Thales's head from his shoulders," Lysithea said slightly mutinously. Dimitri winced slightly at the phrasing, not because he felt any sympathy for Thales, but it was a bit too close to what his hallucinations used to demand of him regarding his stepsister. "Well, if you're that worried, stay close," he said after a second, briefly patting her on the shoulder. She tried to shrug him off, but it's a half-hearted effort. "We intend to stay on Marianne's heels until her crest's power surge has run its course." "That's the best idea I've heard all day," Felix complained, spinning on one heel. "She should have stayed back at the monastery like Emile, damn it. This can't be good for her not losing more ground to that radiation. Suthies is remembering a little more every day, Felix," Byleth said as the group started to run, chasing the trail of destruction that Marianne and Maurice were leaving in their wake. She can't help but notice that this entire time, Maurice had been staying close to his wayward descendant, even in the depths of his blood fever madness. Hopefully, she'll be able to cure Marianne very soon. "I was thinking, Professor, if she can cure Marianne of the radiation, does that mean she can change the Valley of Torment back to normal?" Cyril asked. He stalled briefly to avoid an arrow from a sniper, then counter him down before he target Lysithea. Saint Macule said it used to be farmland. "It's something to think about," Byleth started, before grunting and turning briefly to cast Aura at a fortress knight. From beyond it, Ferdinand raised his lance in gratitude, then spun to attack something else as Constance's bolting rained from the sky. Claude stuttered a step when Dimitri laughed. "Ah, sorry, I couldn't help myself," his king admitted as the group skidded to a halt at a corner. A wave of swordsmen and mages were waiting for them, and likely them specifically. "I just recalled something I said about you once, Claude." It had merely been a jest at the time. Khalid grinned wryly before whistling up Fallen Star again. Somehow, despite their ancestors having forged it out of bone, the group of enemies was remarkably unprepared for the homing arrow that proceeded to cut right through them. Indek and Cyril took care of those on the rooftops, while Lysithea blasted the rubble that Marianne had easily scaled, but would slow them down, into non-existence in the name of clearing their path. That's when an unearthly, horrific sound reverberated across the whole floor. It made Claude's blood freeze up in his veins, his teeth chatter, and a voice at the back of his brain scream, "Flee, flee, flee," just like when he first met Maurice. He wordlessly whipped his head around to stare at Indek, hoping for an explanation. He really doesn't like that the saint looked pale and disturbed as well. "What in the name of the goddess was that?" Bernadetta squeaked out. "They have demonic beasts down here." "I wouldn't be surprised, but that doesn't sound like any beast I've ever encountered." "Including Maurice," Byleth said, a tremor in her voice. Is this what Maurice sensed approaching?" There's a flash of light, warp, judging by the color of the magic. Whatever it was landed a few streets over from them, the buildings are obscuring it, but Claude can see parts of the being. It's big, as tall as Maurice though not as broad. It's glowing red. Much like, he, as if his gaze is drawn by a magnet, looked down at Artemis's bow. At the red stone blazing with light within, pulsing as if reacting to a similar presence. "I think we better go find out," he said a little bleakly. Byleth nodded urgently. There's a faint glow of green in her eyes. Claude's stomach dropped in alarm. Macule was still circling overhead. Some time ago, either the surge protectors had kicked in or he had managed to destroy one of the Viscum generators, because there had been much fewer magic lances falling from the ceiling like deadly rain. Right now, Macule seemed to be searching for more Titanus to obliterate with extreme prejudice. Then a massive ball of red golden magic flew up from the place where the whatever had just been dropped off and struck him in the chest. Instead of shrugging it off, Mikhail screamed in agony, stalling in place long enough for a second one to hit him. He loses his strength, and plummeted to the floor, catching himself mere feet above it to avoid a nasty crash. Mikhail! Indek screamed in desperate worry, even above his shock. He made an abortive gesture to run in that direction before Byleth snagged his wrist. He's alive, she reassured him, her eyes blazing with the reversal of time. Claude bleakly wondered what had happened that she was frantically reversing. He's alive, and he landed near Rodrigue, Tiana, and Judith. He can still defend himself a bit and they can help him get to Merci. Indek still looked anxious to all burning flames, and Claude didn't blame him in the slightest. But he didn't look like he'd bolt now. We have to deal with the new intrusion, he said firmly. That wasn't one of Ren's arrows. No, it wasn't. Byleth said bleakly. She turned and gave Dmitri a look. It was so sad, grieving on his behalf, that a sick certainty struck Claude's heart with the force of an arrow. Be ready for a hard fight, everyone. And then they ran toward the new monster. They skidded into the massive town square and Khalid felt his heart seize up in a slurry of horror, disgust, nausea, fear, and disbelief as he beheld their newest opponent. Because it was a beast, yet it wasn't a beast the likes of which they'd seen before. Because it was Edelgard. At least, the spider-like abomination had Edelgard's head, surrounded by claws and scales, her eyes gaping black pits of glowing red. Her body is elongated, truly making her as tall as Maurice. It's covered in black scales, thick red magic coursing across her entire frame in several thick layers. Her arms drape down her sides, spindly claws extending from each joint, even more twisted and wrong-looking than Marianne's half-beast form. There's no better description than glowing orbs in the giant protrusions of her shoulders. She doesn't have a waist. It looked like a doll made by a particularly disturbed child, all spikes and wrong proportions and inhuman features all over. Her expression was empty, placid, there might be rings around her eyes but Claude can't get close enough to say for certain. Dmitri choked out, staring in horrified disbelief up at the monolithic thing hovering before them. El. What is that? Indek wondered in disbelief. Who cares, it's looking at us now. Felix yelled, snapping them out of their stunned horror when the creature, Edelgard, turned toward them. Byleth immediately grabbed Dmitri by the hand and dragged him to the right. Claude snagged Lysithea and does the same, his heart pounding in his chest as that ball of magic struck the floor where they had been standing. The very walls of the city and its ceiling-hanging walkway shudder on the impact that chatters his teeth and almost flung him off his feet. Briefly Claude's mind rushed back to the umbral beast in the mausoleum, how horrific and bizarre and tough it had been, how long it had taken to go down. Thank God his mind never slowed down. The umbral beast, its resilience had come partly from the chalice of beginnings, which had been fused into it. Edelgard had the crest of flames. Suthisa's blood. It was grafted onto her, but she could do something with it, maybe this was why Thales and his men had given it to her in the first place. It was why she could hurt Mikhail so badly, when all but the mirror relic weapons bounced off his hide and posed little threat to him. Fuck, Byleth and Indek were in danger. They needed to be covered for. Weak points, Edelgard's head was protected but fairly exposed. She'd probably thank him at this point. Khalid took stock of the area, Bernadetta was scrambling for cover, Felix pushing her back while keeping the Aegis shield raised up to guard her. Byleth was speaking urgently to Dmitri, running onward as the beast Edelgard swiped at them with her massive claws. Cyril ran right between his legs to a new vantage point. Almost giving him a heart attack when he noticed him, Indek had climbed up onto the roofs, already taking shots at her massive shoulders. Also making himself a massive target, but that meant Beast Edelgard wasn't paying attention to any of them. Oh, don't you dare die, Claude thinks feverishly. Key. Lysithea asked, her voice shaking horribly. For once, she truly sounded her age. Claude isn't sure if she's horrified on Edelgard's behalf, scared that she was meant for this fate too, afraid that Byleth would be forced to expend her power intensely killing it, or maybe all of the above. Key, what do we do? What do you mean, what? he asked with the same playfulness he'd summoned whenever they fought these sorts of monsters. She twisted to stare at him, and he forced himself to smile for her. She's a different kind of demonic beast. You can see how she has the same scales as Maurice, yeah? Do what you always do, and are the undisputed queen of. Seeing Lysithia's stubborn strength break through, the absolute terror in her eyes gave him strength too. She nodded sharply. Cover for me, she says sternly. Claude grinned and nodded, then pivots to face the titanic monster. Linhard must have drawn close enough to be within his magic range. Along with Happy, Claude heard Byleth yelling out warp orders to the pair as Beast Edelgard vainly tries to find the beast attracting Happy amidst the cluttered city roads. The red-haired girl is faster on her feet, however, weaving around and around, dodging the massive balls of magic at her heels. I really hope those buildings got evacuated. Indek and Lysithea start hammering away at Beast Edelgard's shields. With their combined might, they break the first one fairly quickly, but the deeper ones seem to be drawing on deeper and deeper energy wells, because their will is being resisted. The crest of flames doing, no doubt, why else would it be so able to guard hits from a relic, a sacred weapon and seraphim when those usually turned beasts into mincemeat? Bernadetta and Felix were sadly preoccupied. Various Agarthan soldiers were swarming around them, wanting to pick them off when their whole attention is devoted to the monster in front of them. Felix's blade strikes slashed through them while Bernadetta shot them down. Somewhere in the chaos of noise around them, Claude thought he could hear the others converging towards them. Not that he has time to think about it. He has to bolt hard right when Happy accidentally bolted past his hiding place, taking Lysithea with him as the incredible magic power pulps the ground behind them again. This time he does trip and stumble, and it's Lysithea who yanked him to his feet. He spun around and kept firing. Hey Happy, think you can keep distracting her? He shouted above the chaos, as the sword of the Creator dug blazing gashes into Beast Edelgard's back. He realized with a jolt of panic that the sheer amount of rubble and holes in the floor, literal holes, he can just barely see the third floor, far 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 below them, through the areas where her blows had landed, they're being hemmed in. Trapped. What do you think I'm trying to do? Happy yelled back from somewhere far away sounding. Call me crazy, but I think something's fighting against my inherently tasty scent. You guys need to get out of there. Noted. Claude looked at the pile of rubble next to him, leading almost all the way up to the rooftop, grimacing. He then grabbed a protesting Lysithea and lifted her halfway up. Climb, Lys, I'll be right behind you, he ordered. Keep up the pressure. He hoped the offensive action would encourage her, and sure enough, she doesn't complain and scrambles her way up. Cyril was already on a roof, near Indek. The saint actually tossed him down onto the stable floor on the other side where someone grabbed him. Second later, one of Beast Edelgard's distance attacks hits the building, sending him flying off to the floor. If he weren't so absurdly tough, like his siblings, Claude would have been worried. Khalid. Byleth shouted in worry. Hoggies. Claude shrieked when Beast Edelgard turned around and swung her massive clawed hand toward her. Blessedly grateful to Artemis's blood, I'm sorry but thank you for saving me so many times. He throws himself out of the way and onto burning coals, ignoring the agonizing burning as his coat catches fire. He shot Fallen Star before rolling on the dirty floor to put out the flames. His back initially screams in pain, but blessed healing washed over him seconds later as his arrow struck home, cracking the second barrier. He's still struggling to his feet when he sees Beast Edelgard spin around and attack Dimitri. Or, try to, because Marianne, still in her beast form, came flying over one of the rooftops and landed on her back just above her head, digging her claws in. Beast Edelgard screams wordlessly, her skeletal wings beating awkwardly as they tried to swat at girl clinging to her. Marianne roared, maybe apologizing, maybe cursing Thales as Beast Edelgard threw out another magical attack at quick speed but terrible accuracy. Nevertheless, it landed dangerously close to Dimitri, who dropped partway into a hole in the floor. Byleth lay down on the floor in time to grab his wrist and save him from a fatal fall, but she had to briefly put the sword down, and Indek has to save them both with a flurry of arrows as Marianne slashed at Beast Edelgard's head, scoring straight through the two shields as if they weren't there. Marianne, be careful! Ash cried, appearing one of the rooftops. He fired the Parthia's arrows into Beast Edelgard's stomach, possibly searching for a critical organ to destroy, Claude would be doing the same if he had any idea where this beast had fragile anatomy. If Marianne could hear him, she doesn't give any sign of it. As Byleth pulled Dimitri out of the hole and got back to her feet sword in hand, she delivered a devastating flurry of pounding blows, just like Maurice punching through walls and floors on his way down, that shattered the barrier around Edelgard's head, allowing her to rake her glowing claws over the beast form's face and eyes. Beast Edelgard let out a bone-rattling, earth-shaking scream in response, both her shoulders glow, firing spheres of destructive power in all directions. It destroyed houses, continued to damage the increasingly tenuous floor, and nearly struck Indek head on if Lysithea hadn't pulled him down in time. The impacts throw Byleth off her feet again. Raw terror seizes Claude's throat as Marianne gets tossed off by Beast Edelgard's violent motion, turning toward Byleth. He grabbed his fellow classmate out of the air, and that's when Maurice makes his appearance. Thundering across the floor, eyes blazing, Maurice tackled Beast Edelgard, taking the two magic attacks directly to his chest as he slammed his jaw tightly around her upper body. His teeth leave through the cracked second barrier and the full third one with the blazing light of his crest. Magic explodes out of the cracks in Beast Edelgard's body. "Fly, Indek! Fly!" Maurice screeched at them as the floor that had been so ruined gave way with a final, shrieking tearing of steel and stone. The world dropped out from underneath Claude's feet, and he and Marianne are falling. Indek grabbed them. How he transformed, got under him so he landed awkwardly on his shell wings and kept banking wildly to catch the others who had fallen, Claude didn't know. The wind is knocked out of him, his mind is scrambling to catch up, his eyes fixed blearily on the hole in the sky floor above him as huge chunks debris rained down all around them. Lysithea landed near him, and Marianne lashed out to grab her in a clawed grip to haul her closer, saving her from getting crushed under a massive steel block that crumpled against Indeka's wing. Maurice and Beast Edelgard fall past them, still fighting on the way down. There's a great tearing noise, a breath of flame and poison, an explosion of magic as they go by. It seemed strangely slow to Claude, like time had slowed down all around him. He tilted his head to the right and saw Ash clinging to the indentations of Indeka's shell back for dear life, Cyril holding on right next to him, Byleth and Dimitri across from him with the ladder underneath the former supported by the other wing. Leonard had somehow fallen down with them, though he'd been lucky enough to land on Indeka's head, which had horns easy to grasp. There's a thundering crash beneath them, a whole lot of alarmed and confused screaming that's different from the noise coming from the floor above them. Indek unleashed a torrent of water from his breath, blowing away a landing zone as he sluggishly floated down to the ground, wincing at the seemingly endless debris raining down on him as he descended. Then he landed on the ground and time snapped back to its regular flow. Khalid let out a torrent of swearing in his first tongue as he rolled down his wing. Thankfully, he hadn't lost Artemis's bow. It had landed on the ground, unburied, just a few feet away. He scrambled to go get it, glancing worriedly back at Marianne. She seemed fine, if rattled. In fact, it seemed the shock was causing her berserk blood to recede. Her transformation disappeared moments later, leaving a panting Marianne stumbling off of Indeka's lowered wing. Lysithea followed moments later, thyrsus glowing on her back, her gaze bleary. Even in the midst of her exhaustion, Marianne lifted a hand to cast heal on her. His heart pounding in sudden terror. Byleth. Dimitri. Claude whipped around and bolted around Indeka's massive frame. Most of the others must have gotten off, because the saint started to shift back into his human form as he passed his face, desperately seeking his two beloved ones. "Please be okay, please be okay." Byleth was standing when he clapped eyes on them, berating Dimitri a little hysterically. Their king wasn't ignoring her, no, not at all, but he was clearly more interested in whether or not he had sufficiently protected her stomach. Claude ran to them, interrupting the disagreement to grab both of them in a tight hug. "Claude," Byleth gasped in relief, nuzzling his shoulder when she got over her surprise. "Thank goodness, you weren't hurt in the fall. Is everyone else more alright?" "Everyone's shaken, can't speak for Indek though he seems to be getting up on his own." "You saw this would happen?" he asked her anxiously. She laughed shakily in response, her light green-gold eyes wide with distress. Claude resisted the urge to flinch at that distress. It was a lot worse the first time around. "The babies. Suthies says they're fine, don't worry." Byleth bit her lip, clearly wishing to scold Dmitri more but realizing he was more or less immune to it for that reason, and looked to the side. Ah, Indek. She runs to her brother, the two of them at her heels. Indek is kneeling, rubbing his shoulders and visibly in pain. There were tangible bloodstains on multiple places across his body. It was the most damage Claude had ever seen him take. Well, that was unexpected, he coughed when they reached him. Claude's laugh was a little broken up. You are the single most calm person I have ever met, he informed the Nabatean, who chuckled in response. Byleth placed her hands on him, just as she's casting recover. Lysithea called for them. Maurice and Edelgard, oh God. Dmitri, despite everything that girl had done to him, looked stricken, then ran towards their other friends. Indek stood when Byleth's recover spell ran its course, and the followed suit, worried about what he might see. They don't have to go far. Ash, Marianne, Lysithea, Cyril, and Linhard are all standing in a line, staring at the wreckage in front of them. The two beasts had landed in the most unfortunate way possible. Maurice had crashed down to the floor on his side, but Beast Edelgard, she was impaled on the Viscum spire. As they approached, both bodies began to glow in a soft white light. Just like all the other beasts they had killed who had once been humans, their beastly forms began to dissolve. Byleth is silent for a second, then starts to glow as she walks forward. Her hair shimmers as she shifted places with Suthies, walking quietly toward the cracked floor where Maurice had fallen. Marianne was running ahead of her, Maurice's body crumbling into stardust around her to reveal the human body lying, so much smaller and more fragile looking. Claude halted a couple dozen feet away, watching as Marianne knelt next to Maurice. Suthies and Indek also outpace him, though they don't impede his view. Maurice, it was shocking how much he looked like Marianne. He was slender, slight, his scarred skin lightly tanned and soft-looking, his long dark blue hair lies around his shoulders and throat. His clothes are blood-stained and torn, yet not too different in design from Marianne's priestess robe. Was the design passed down through the family? Pressed at his side was a long bone sword, glittering eerily in the artificial light of Shamhala, Bloodgong. He looked so small. So powerless. So strangely young, as if he was merely a few years older than his descendant rather than 1,000. Marianne gently lifted his head into her lap. Maurice's eyes fluttered open, they were light blue, just like hers. You, he said, his human voice is a soft alto. You're Marianne, right? You look like my Alyssa. Hello, Maurice, Marianne said with a tiny, sad smile. Didn't we promise that it would be over? Yes, Maurice whispered. You jumped in front of Byleth, she murmured. I could sense the children, Maurice coughed hard, his form shivering. Wanted to do one thing right, my body moved on its own. Suthies and Indek knelt on either side of him. Maurice blinked blearily at him. He's dying, Claude knew, and there's a strange ache in his heart as the one who terrorized his lands for years, the one who devoured a child for power, begins to slip away before their eyes. This, you should, take this, Maurice whispered, trembling as he lifted Bloodgong toward Indek. A painfully grief-stricken look crossed the Nabatean's face, at the memory of Lien. Give him, to his father, once everything is done. Maurice, Suthies murmured. Why didn't the Agarthans tell you what Lien was? I didn't want to kill children. Maurice admitted, coughing again. It was the only real thing that I held on to. Because I had to bleed so much, just to survive. I thought he was an animal, some sort of beast sacred to you, who had abandoned us, he laughed wetly. I didn't know anything, in the end. Indek briefly shut his eyes. Then he took Lien's bone sword from Maurice, setting it down by the side before looking down at Maurice. He just looked sad. They're the ones who dug you out of your village. Weren't they? Maurice nodded imperceptibly, before a hesitant look crossed his face. Is it meaningless to apologize? He asked raspily. Never. Indek murmured with such gentleness and sadness, Claude was silently in awe. Tears dripped lightly down Maurice's cheeks. I'm so sorry. He whispered. I believe you. Suthies said with a simplicity that could only be divine, a weight to her words that Claude had never heard before as she teased and played with him and the others. She leaned over and kissed the former monster's temple. There was a great flash of light, and Morris's body was surrounded by golden light as the man's eyes fluttered shut. "Go in peace, child." Morris's body, rather than simply slump on the ground, dissolved into starlight. Marianne looked up with a little smile on her face. The scene couldn't last, unfortunately. An anguished wail sent Claude sprinting forward, up to where Dmitri was kneeling in front of the Viscum spire, crying, looking up at the corpse of Edelgard von Hresvelg, blackened and impaled on the magic spire. Knowing that words were little comfort now, knowing that the army of Agartha would likely recover and converge on them fairly soon, Claude wrapped his arms around his beloved to embrace him tightly as the others rushed to his side. He murmured the words he needed to say, drying his king's tears, before looking darkly up at Edelgard's body on the spire. He isn't ready to blame everything she chose to do on the Agarthans. He isn't interested in letting her out of responsibility for her choices. But he does bet that she wouldn't have become the person that she was if she hadn't been tortured by them and watched her siblings die. That she was stripped of a better life. And he hated that, hated how Thales had destroyed an ordinary princess and how he had still managed to hurt Dmitri one last time. "We're beating you, Thales. We're close to your javelins of light. I hope you're scared. I want you to suffer before you die for everything you've done to those I love." Chapter 94. Byleth was anxious. She waited for the army to join them. She knows that they haven't been written off as dead, her friends, Sirios, and Sikal. They knew about her rewind power and that she hadn't exhausted it yet, and they would not allow the army to panic. They would hold them together and get them downstairs as quickly as possible. The situation they're in, just a handful of them surrounded by the very angry and likely very panicked army of Thales and counselors, is hardly ideal, but it's a damn sight better than if the beast they'd turned Edelgard into had been able to rampage to her full potential. She gritted her teeth and violently shoved her emotions, strengthened as they were by her pregnancy, into the depths of her stone heart to be dealt with later. The memories she kept of what might have been were a curse. She had so many memories of deaths and bloodshed that hadn't actually happened to carry her nightmares for the rest of her mortal existence. She can't break down here, and she refuses to show Thales and his ghouls how badly they had shaken her. Can't think about Edelgard and the painful mix of emotions that were attached to her, can't waste time trying to comfort herself. Can't do anything but acknowledge that she needed to conserve her usage of Divine Pulse for what still lay ahead. Can't afford to try and go back again to try and find a better outcome of that unexpected deployment. Just a little bit further. Just a little bit more, and they can finally close this chapter of history. Then they can rest. Byleth bemusedly wondered how long Linhard would note that he'd had the right of things all along and rest was underrated. She had conflicting opinions on that kind of hindsight humor, but from him, she's sympathetic now. Fight, then rest indeed. "I'm all right, Byleth," Dmitri assured her, his voice steady and firm despite the look of grief in her eyes. Byleth briefly wondered if Edelgard would have felt the same despair at his death that he did for hers, and doesn't like how uncertain she is. He clutched Vishnu's bone lance like a lifeline. Marianne and Lysithea are both openly giving him concerned looks. "No, you're not," Claude responded, frowning. "Perhaps," Dmitri said, shaking his head. "But I cannot mourn now, and I will not lose myself when I am most needed. I can't. I refuse." The words came out almost as a hiss, and Byleth suspected that he was speaking as much to himself as them. "We'll come back for her body, Dmitri. We will find the time and we will not let her be further desecrated." Indek promised him, his voice kind and soothing still despite how emotionally rattled he too is. Bloodgong was strapped firmly to his side. Marianne having repeatedly refused his urging to take it, she would not bow to the bitter practicality, preferred the torment of her irradiated dragon form to so much as laying a hand on his nephew's child's bones. "I will remember," Suthies had said so vehemently when her son revealed the source of her friend's anguish. "I must. I will save her from this end." Byleth trusted her. She thought that perhaps defeating Nemesis, now the only other being who bore her stolen blood, more might return to her goddess all at once. She hoped so. Dmitri shuddered, his head tilting downward for a moment. "Thank you," he said with a pained rumble. "I'm afraid of what some in the army might do. Some have more than just cause, particularly those deserters who came to us because of her tyranny, but I would rather hope that cutting up her dead body would be beneath us, Ash mumbled, peering nervously around the corner of the street. I'm sure Lord Rodrigue won't let it happen. He runs a nervous hand through his hair. I think we've managed to give the patrols a runaround for now, but once Pitacus notices a blind spot in the owl vision, won't she send everyone there? This hiding place is strangely conspicuous. I know, Byleth admitted sourly, glancing up at the couple of cameras they'd broken around the backstreet that they'd commandeered after fleeing their impromptu landing zone. I hadn't truly appreciated it until this moment, but the owl gaze system make any sort of sneaking around a nightmare. It's good we're just burning time rather than trying to actively hide. How do these people not go crazy with paranoia, knowing they're always being watched? Lysithea asked incredulously. From what we've been seeing so far, I think a lot of them do. Cyril suggested, glancing at the houses to their lefts. A few brave civilians were peering through their windows at them, but they instantly vanished deep into the houses when spotted. When you're so scared of what someone's gonna do to you, every day, all the time, you get really desperate to please them. Them and their words and their demands become the whole world. After a while, you're not even sure which way is up because you don't trust your own thoughts anymore. You know that because Hilda and Holst's dad had been treating you like a slave, don't you? Lysithea asked with a quiet that was somehow both an artificial blanket over a boiling rage, and muted sadness. Cyril nodded. Yeah. I thought I'd hate everyone in Agartha because of how much they hurt Lady Rhea, Lady Sirios. But now that I've seen all of this, I just feel sorry for them. Maybe I would have ended up like them if Holst hadn't ensured I met my lady way back when. No way, Lysithea swore spiritedly, her eyes blazing at the thought. You're way too strong to ever be broken by assholes like Thales. I dunno, Cyril murmured, even as he blushed from the compliment. I do. You're one of the toughest person I've ever met, like Dimitri and Didu and Bernadetta and Atra, because despite all the shit that was dumped on you, no matter how bad things got, you never broke. You never become like her, or even like me. Lysithea was winding up for a rant, and by the sounds of things, it was one she'd gone on before. Byleth can see Dimitri flush in surprised pleasure at Lysithea's denoting of him. He looked like he wished to correct her but didn't dare try to interrupt. You still want to help people, and you look at life as something that can always get better. I stopped doing that after my siblings died. How can you say that? Cyril protests at that last remark, sounding a little upset. You're strong too, Lysithea, even though you lost so much, you never lay down and resigned yourself to anything. You could have been like the Emperor, but you've always chosen to protect other people. You might be spiky and confrontational, but you're still an amazing person. Lysithea sputtered, her face turning a bright red. Hey, you can't just interrupt me with something like that. Indeka's shoulders shivered as he adjusted his hood, he's clearly smothering a teasing fit of laughter. Claude, Ash, and Marianne all watched the back and forth with pleased smiles, while Linhard yawned and rubbed his eyes. Are you sure you can't save the flirting until we get out of here? He asked sleepily. Who said anything about flirting? Lysithea and Cyril chanted in concert, spinning around and giving the green-haired priest a double-barreled glare despite their furious blushes giving away their real feelings. Literally everyone, Linhard responded. Yuri has a bunch of pots running, and you've been one of them ever since the Bridge of Murden. He what? Didn't you notice how Lawrence and Leonie were giving Claude side-eye? He won theirs, and he got quite a bit. Not sure if Yuri's going to win Balthus and Hilda's, though. The two of them might try and hold out on principle. Of course he did, Cyril mumbled, looking helpless. He always knows, how does he always know? Lysithea was so flustered her face resembled a tomato. I swear, I'm going to put so much pepper in his next meal, she vowed. He's going to be breathing fire like a lizard-type beast for the next week, just you watch. Byleth can't help herself, she giggled too, and in her mind, she can hear Suthies howling with laughter over the obnoxious warning sirens blaring across the floor and the occasional crash thud of the Titaness moving about in search of them. Lysithea sulked adorably as Dimitri covered his mouth and Claude laughed. You all suck, she informed them grumpily. Unfortunately, they only get a few seconds to enjoy that moment of levity. Found you. The cheerful words acted as a warning, which she suspected was deliberate, when she glanced upward to the right and saw a familiar blazing flare of orange-gold light. Grabbing Listhii by the arm, Byleth flung herself backward, letting her student crash down on top of her when the arrow of mirror fail not slammed into the street where she had been standing. The others had heard the voice too, and scattered all across the road. Byleth doesn't get the wind knocked out of her when she hits the ground, but she's far more mindful of hits to her body than ever before, so it's with a reproachful scowl that she got to her feet and stared upward at the twosome who had approached them. Ah, Michael went the wrong way, Ren von Regan mused as he emerged from the shadow of the balcony he was perched on. His voice is just as harsh and unnatural as when they first heard it, but now it's far less distorted. His words are fully comprehensible, not needing to be run over several times before they made sense. He was hoping to find you first, Prince Eling Dimitri. But he and Rena went to one of the stairwells, whoops. Hey, maybe they'll get turned around. He drew his bow back and fired again. This time Claude swung his own fail not up to meet him and launched an arrow in turn. Again the two collide with a massive crash of magical power, dozens of windows shatter up the wall and down the street, causing screams of alarm from the inhabitants. Not that Byleth had time to dwell on that. A dozen or so feet away from her, Index swore and turned back down the road, firing multiple arrows from the inexhaustible. Byleth and Lysithea both pivoted just in time to see each of those dozen arrows hit a fireball, a storm of which had been launched from the hand of a single man. He's not as tall as Ren or Michael, he's roughly the same height as Felix, but not nearly as bulky and muscular. He's slender as a waif, his mage robes fluttered around his small frame as he danced around another volley from Indek. As he moved, the dark magic of Luna appearing in 3 spots with a wave of his hand, swallowing up the magical arrows and causing them to dissipate into nothing. Byleth could just see underneath his black hood. He has the same burning red-orange eyes and death-bleached gray and pale, bluish-purple skin. The robes themselves are light but clearly handmade, likely his personal royal garb from when he had been one of the 10. Blast, Indek said in dismay, even as he moved to dodge retaliation. We weren't fast enough. They've woken all of them. We knew that would probably be the case. Byleth tried to comfort him as she drew the Suthisa's sword and swung it in a wide arc. The many blades strike the storm of spells that the elite sends at them, a literal storm, casting faster than anyone she'd ever seen. It reminded her of the double effect that Thunderbrand possessed. Was he truly capable of something that insane without a channel to support him? He didn't look like he was holding a staff like Thyrsis. Which one of them is it? Not Angel, she would have stood back while hailing bolting and meteor on them like the nightmare being she was. With her excluded, the other mages in the elites were. The mage darted forward, meeting Lysithea's instant counter-attack of a fully powered Hades with one of his own. The dark magic clash is just as intense as the 2 fail-not arrows, and when the spells explode, the whole 3rd floor of Shamhala was plunged into absolute darkness, the artificial light swallowed up and devoured. A whole lot of panicked screaming echoed from every direction. There are faint lights in the distance, the glow of the Titaness as they sluggishly turned about in confusion. Byleth knew that Sirius and the others would hold firm and find solutions to the darkness, but this was not a good turn of events. I need to get back to them now. Oh heaven help us, all 10 of them will be on the move. Don't panic, you saved my command of the hands of time for this very purpose, Suthis reminded her, always there to help her keep her bearings, helping her be the war machine that their army needed now. Now go get a grasp of the situation. Byleth hurriedly brought up Suthisa's sword, the blade's eerie glow illuminating the street in a wideish circle around her. Off to the side, she can see similar flares of light from Eridbar and the 2 fail-nots. Lysithea scrambled closer to her, looking very much like she was wishing she and Lawrence had traded sacred staves again. Not you, the new voice said in despair. It's less light-toned than Ren's, though it carried the same muted accent. I didn't want to fight you, not any of you, but especially not you. You don't have a choice, Byleth said, almost instinctively attempting to ease the terrible grief in that voice. Ren told us about the geese some time ago. I understand your situation. Bear with us, we'll bring this nightmare to a close once and for all. It was only after she said the words that she noticed he was staring at Lysithea in particular, and that the words were meant for her. The response is a rattling, slightly hysterical laugh, red light glowed, a flurry of fire spells at the ready, and Byleth was forced to swing the sword in a defensive curve once again. It sounded like teetering on the edge of madness. It's a farce, isn't it? I've risen from my grave, bearing all my stolen divinity and a new immunity to pain, and I can't even stop myself from attacking my granddaughter. Granddaughter. Lysithea parried, her eyes widening. Wait, the only other girl here is Marianne, and Byleth is Dash, her breath audibly caught in her throat, even as she's forced to leap away from Bjeltha's side by a flurry of miasma before trying to retaliate in kind. You're Julius Karen. Yes, Julius lamented, again using Luna to dissipate Indeka's attack. The smooth, dance-like nature of his movement reminded Byleth that he was the one who pioneered the mortal savant fighting style, though if he has a sword, she can't see it in the dark. Although, there was a low glow of orange at his side. Little Lysithea, you're a miracle. You know that, I hope. You've survived so much, and I couldn't even avenge you on Myson when he woke me. I'm sorry. Myson? Myson? Avenge? Even in the low light, Byleth could see Lysithea's face go absolutely bloodless. She reached out to grab her friend before she can do something reckless, but she misjudged thanks to the lack of light and misses her as the white-haired girl lunged forward, charging into the dark toward Julius's voice. He was the one. He led the experiment. He killed Sonia and Xavier and Maya and Dash. Lysithea, don't get baited. Byleth yelled uselessly after her, cursing her moment of surprise when Julius dropped that revelation on her. She moved to go after him, but an arrow from Failnaught slammed into the floor in front of her, forcing her to stop and turn to swing the blade at Ren. Indek bolted after Lysithea into the darkness, his bow glowing, and she prayed he'll be able to protect her. Ever gone hunting at night? Or just late in the evening? Ren asked curiously, irreverently. Byleth can hear him moving around, and tried to track him by his weapon. Honest question, I had to spend some time walking as far out as I dared from the village to snipe owls. Otherwise this is a bit unfortunate. Dear Suthies, I think you might be as chatty as Claude. Byleth grumbled, unable to formulate any other kind of response to that. Of all things to be passed down through 1,000 years. You love me, Claude's teasing voice echoed from somewhere nearby. She briefly looked to her right to see him running toward her before jumping out of the way of another arrow that explodes on contact with the road. I do, Suthies help me, she said, responding automatically to his teasing. A flare of green light somewhere behind them told her that Linhard was healing someone, probably Dimitri, who'd gotten injured when she was distracted with Julius. Myson ordered me to go and destroy the army. If he didn't think to order me not to talk while doing it, that's his own fault. Ren responded lazily. There's a clatter of footsteps which suddenly stop, the orange-yellow light of the relic moving upward again. And Thales hates it when I run my mouth. Boy does he hate it. Boo-hoo, like I've never heard anyone threaten to cut my tongue out before. Somehow, none of them succeeded. You sound a lot better than I remember from Inver, Claude remarked as he fired a couple arrows his way. Two miss and another collides again to a massive explosion. Byleth wondered if any of the confused, disoriented, and alarmed enemy would follow the obvious signs of the clashing relics to their location. They must have gotten you into tip-top shape for this. They knew we were coming, huh? Course they did, not that they cared to warn their people. You know, for enlightened ones, those six are depressingly familiar to me. Ren said the words with a carelessness that hid a poisonous, burning rage. They're not special in the slightest. You're under a geese, can we get it off you, somehow? Claude wondered, even as they were forced to dance around each other's attacks. Ren's accuracy was deadly, somehow seemingly mostly unburdened by the darkness. It forced them on the defensive, forced them to fight for every inch of ground, but Byleth can't help remembering what Flane had said about him. Ren didn't miss. Ever. Was he fighting the geese even now? Struggling tooth and nail against the spell that had surely been improved each time he and the others proved to be uncooperative? Would killing Myson end it? Claude chased his train of logic, a note of actual hope in his voice. Byleth suspected it wasn't just because that would mean they wouldn't have to keep fighting the elites, if they managed to drive them off long enough to get to that man and gut him. If it was him, if he was the one who killed Lysithea's siblings and mutilated her, Byleth was going to beat him black and blue with her fists before she forced a fire spell directly down his throat. Set you free. Ahaha, I wish, I wish, Ren said wistfully, indicating he had been nearby long enough to hear Byleth or Dimitri call his descendant that. Did he make any sound when he walked, to pull that off? But our little unlives aren't just tied to him, they're tied to the crest of flames. It's what's sustaining us right now, so we'd go from being bound to him to bound to you-know-who. He might have wiggled a finger at Byleth, but she can't tell in the dark. It was something Khalid would have done. Not your version of the crest, unfortunately. Wouldn't that have been nice? You must be referring to, you say that as if he isn't giving you commands in the moment. The king is not awake yet. Dimitri's voice came out of the darkness. Byleth briefly saw Cyril rush past her to join Lysithea and Indek against Julius, whose magic battle was sending constant brief flashes of light illuminating the floor. Why hasn't Thales done so? Is he still confident he can win, despite the odds? No, he's terrified of Ronan. Ren responded bluntly as he fired again. Byleth swung the sword to break it, and Linhard threw a wind spell at the sniper's perch to force him to jump down. Claude grabbed her by the arm and yanked her out of the way of the second arrow. She hadn't even seen him firing. Failnate isn't supposed to have a double effect, damn it. Even though all that, she didn't miss how his voice shuddered on the name, and Byleth knew he must mean Nemesis despite it not being the same. He doesn't want to wake him up. He'll use those missiles he'd pretended to have disposed of before he leaves himself at my former lord's non-existent mercy. So he will use them. Dimitri snarled in frightened rage. Ren expertly dodged around his lance swing, then avoided Marianne's Thoron before bringing his bow up and firing it. Byleth's blood froze for a terrifying moment, but after the crashing impact, she can see Marianne, Ash, and Linhard in the light of Eridbar/Vishnu's lance. He's truly so full of hate that he'd rather destroy the world if he cannot rule it himself. What can I say? Ren said with that chilling anger. Some people just can't stand to lose. Do you know where they are? Byleth asked, wondering how far Ren could push his rebellion, if it was possible for him to let slip just a little bit more or if the geese would render it impossible. Atra called it the missile silos. Do you know where? 4th floor, northwest corner, the gates behind 2 hidden doors and a whole lot of magic electrical security. She could hear Ren smirking. And maybe he can see how their jaws dropped even in the low light, because he laughed with sadistic glee a second later. Even his ugly purple bonds appeared all over his body and squeezed him painfully. If there's anything to be said about being undead, it's that no one thinks that you're listening to them. Thank you, Byleth said fervently, the ache of panic in her chest, herself and Suthies, so desperately alarmed at the confirmation that the missiles were live, that the worst-case scenario was not only possible but likely to be attempted. Loosening just a bit. They have a chance. 4th floor. 2 hidden doors and a lot of security. They were close. Once everyone caught up. I had wondered about that. Atra's voice was followed by the lights of the floor coming back to life, revealing her, Yuri, Aisling and Ignatz at the end of the road. A roar that Byleth now recognized as Sirios as in dragon form shook the room, and Byleth's incredible relief doesn't keep her from blinking stars from her eyes and casting aura right at Ren. He dodged her, light on his feet, and fired an arrow in Indek, Lysithea, and Cyril's direction. It forced them to split up. They'd been trying to pin Julius in a small alleyway, but Ren's attack gave him enough room to slip the noose. The 2 elites rejoined each other, turning toward the blocked-off side street Atra is blocking off. You managed to give Mike and Rena the slip? Ren asked curiously, as to what, precisely, Byleth can only estimate. They were too preoccupied to keep us from getting the army downstairs, Atra responded, sounding confident and daring despite how her hands were trembling. I'm afraid we're continuing to advance. Her expression told Byleth it was slow, however, she needed to get back to the others and get a status report. Well, the sensible thing to do with the Saints on board would be to split up and try and pick off the brave little kittens that are our descendants, yes. Ren said, his smile growing a little sharper as flickers of the geese flashed across his skin. Julius was still moving. Yuri grabbed Ignatz and teleported out of the resulting barrage of fireballs while Atra and Aisling dodged in different directions. Forming a wall would just invite those 3 to wail on us unimpeded. Is that your only reason? Claude asked slyly. Claude? Lysithea demanded with a shaky voice. Byleth wished she had heard what else if anything Julius had said to her. There's so much I want to ask you, Claude told Ren as if he hadn't heard her. Do we really not have the time? For the first time since she'd seen his face clearly, Byleth watched Ren's wicked smile shatter. He stared at Claude for a moment, an incredible wave of emotion falling over him. She saw surprise there, incredible sorrow, fondness, and longing too. The undead sniper let out a rusted laugh, but there was no humor or mockery in his voice. The wistful imagination of a world where that was possible hung too heavily on his voice. You know the answer to that, Ren told him instead of any of those things. You need to hurry and get to Thales. Stick a few arrows in him for me, will you? Julius, after avoiding Aisling's arrows, cast a large fireball upward and then tore out its spark. A huge, billowing wave of smoke filled the alley, leaving every living individual in the street coughing and cursing as they scrambled to get their bearings. This way! Yuri yelled. Get to the end of the road, the air's clearer over here. Byleth heard and obeyed, grabbing Lysithea by the arm to keep her close as she runs forward. The shorter girl is hacking and coughing. She vowed to cast Recover on her as soon as they were out of the killbox they'd been stuck in. As soon as she had a clear field of view again, Ren and Julius were gone. After a quick and slightly frantic debate on whether they should try and chase down the two elites they had been fighting, Byleth decided that getting back to the army was more important. Judging by what Ren said, the elites had deliberately split up, so they were likely all over the place, cutting bloody swathes through anyone other than her family. So despite the significant risk of being ambushed by the master sniper and magical genius, they told Atra and Yuri to take them back to the main force so everyone could get their bearings. I saw someone up on a wyvern with a weapon that looked like the Crusher, Yuri reeled off as they staggered out of another one of his teleportations, his face as pale and anxious, which was rare enough to make Byleth worried. Ah, look, you can see him now, he's in an aerial battle with McCule. Byleth threw a Balganone at a fortress knight without missing a beat as her eyes scanned the massive ceiling. Her blood jumped when she saw McCule, flying again, banking violently as he repeatedly tried to snatch a dark figure out of the air. So that's Dominic, she said breathlessly. I'd forgotten he was a wyvern lord. Do you think he's alone? The utterly cursed sound of meteor answered her question for her. McCule managed to roll like a barrel to avoid the falling magical projectile, resulting in the spell instead striking a Titanus and blasting clean through its magical shields. Oh, fantastic. She's awake, the words came out incredibly fatalistically. At least I'm assuming that isn't Dorothea misjudging a distance call. No, I'm pretty sure it's Angel. Claude countered as they ran full tilt toward Rodrigue and Tiana. Holst was absent, which meant he was fighting somewhere, likely with Hilda, if a certain someone had gone hunting for her. The elites are probably moving about in pairs. It would take a lot of metal jumps to sell attacking army segments alone, and the geese is stronger now. Remember how Ren was able to find a way to tell Thales to fuck off back at Inver. The reminder caused both Yuri and Atra, and surprisingly Ignatz, to burst into a fit of snickers. How could we not? The purple-haired beauty laughed, before becoming serious again. But you're right. They're taking us more seriously now, and it's still not all they have to bring to bear. Oh, Suthies guide us, Dimitri murmured fervently. I'm doing my best. It's a little bit harder without a separate body from Byleth. Suthies said in a strained way. Byleth can feel her anxiety and twisted knot of emotion regarding the elites. Morris's final moments had given her some peace, but there's still a storm building inside the goddess, one that she knew would only reach its apex if or when they encountered Nemesis. Byleth doesn't get a chance to say anything out loud. They burst into the town square where Rodrigue and Tiana are delivering orders from on top of a house. Both of them look incredibly relieved when the give of them climb up to join them, Indek joining them a second later. There you are, Rodrigue gasped in relief, giving Dimitri a hug despite the situation. The young king briefly buried his head in his father figure's shoulders, accepting the brief moment of comfort with a little desperation. I was so worried when the ceiling collapsed underneath that abomination. What was that? I'll explain later, Byleth said hurriedly. The reason I didn't turn back time was that we all got down safely thanks to Indek. Now, the elites dash. Yes, they're out and about, Rodrigue shook his head. Dmitri cried out in alarm when he noticed a thin, recently healed scar on the older man's throat. My own family head, Lady Frildarius, nearly killed me with a spear from a dozen yards away and down the stairs. Felix, Bernadetta, Glenn, and Sirios were able to force her back, but then King Bladed joined in, and they focused on leading them away. Seath went to assist. Byleth could see the raw worry in his eyes, how much he wished he could pass command to someone else and run to help his sons and future daughter-in-law. The one on the Wyvern, Dominic, I'm fairly certain, initially came straight at us, along with Goneril. Tiana reported, scowling. Hilda, Holst, and Balthus went straight for them before they could start slaughtering the front line, and McCule forced Dominic up in the air. Daphne's been spotted out to the north. Ingrid, Sylvain, and Raphael went in pursuit. And we encountered Regan and Karen. That accounts for, what, 8 of them? 9, if that is Angel tossing meteor around instead of Agartha and mages. Byleth counted, grimacing. That leaves just Gloucester unaccounted for, but if they're all on the move, I suspect he's somewhere just out of sight. Goneril is directly ahead of us, Tiana noted. How about you go and give him a dramatic haymaker, to let the army know you're all right? Byleth nodded. I should make a big statement. The elites don't really want to stop us. Regan gave us the location of the missile silo. She turned on her heels to give the future queen of Shamhala an entry-eating look. Atra, do you think you could get past the magical security? He mentioned there would be quite a bit, and you've demonstrated that keys are needed. Atra bit her lip, looking a little anxious. I could do my best, but likely only the highest security clearance will open the doors. Trying to force doors that important will give you a severe magical shock, too. High clearance, which given that most of Agartha believes the missiles have been disposed of, the only people who would have it are the council themselves and their hand-picked maintenance men, Claude deduced before grinning like a shark. Since they're so loyal, and Thales has no scruples, they'll be out and about, keeping tabs on the situation as they wait for launch orders. So, where do you think we can find them? Atra closed her eyes, clearly thinking furiously. For a few agonizingly long seconds, she was silent, and Byleth swallowed over a lump of anxiety in her throat. But when those dark blue eyes opened again, they were burning like the rising sun with righteous determination. I can think of a few places. Chapter 95. Dmitri ran after Byleth, his heart hammering like a drum in his chest as his battle fever warred with the fear built up by a lifetime of stories. Achilles' Goneril was a whirlwind of death, carving through lines of cavalry on foot. His favorite move to sow damage and confusion was to use his crest to turn his weapons into a bat. He would send armored knights flying into ballistas and formations like stone flung from a catapult. It wasn't hard to find the Einherjar, like Rodrigue had said. He was straight ahead, down the smooth concrete road by a few blocks. Dimitri's heart was in his throat when he saw Hilda tumble backwards toward them, wincing and wobbling back to her feet as she scrambled to recover free Kugel. Holst had jumped in front of her just in time to block Achilles' Goneril's titanic blow with his own mirror relic. The War Master laughs, the sound parental and teasing and impressed, throwing the young man several steps back as he ducks and swings out of the way of Balthus's flurry of punches. Dropping down on one knee, Achilles lashed out with one leg and kicked the king of grappling in the side of the leg, staggering him. The Revenant stood up in one smooth movement, blocking Holst's next axe swing and throwing a punch at his face. Balthus cast Seraphim at Goneril's back as he jumped up again. The War Master tanked the hit, though it makes him pause for a second so that Holst could regain his momentum. Hilda has regained her footing at this point and charges back in. Achilles weaves between her and Balthus, forcing them to avoid hitting each other, swinging free Kugel around him again and again like a hoop of death. There are a not insignificant number of bodies all around them, both from their army and from Agartha. Most of the rest were gone, going down the streets after enemies they actually had a prayer of defeating, leaving some healers and guards cowering behind buildings and chunks of metal dropped from Titanus watching the fight. Marvelous! To think you've never been in a true war before! Achilles shouted, his voice reminded Dmitri of Alois, strangely enough. It was something about the cheerful tone and friendliness, which stood in such sharp contrast to the War Master's ruthless fighting style. You've truly only fought in skirmishes before that girl marched on the church. Why do you want to know, Grandpa? Hilda asked indignantly, panting for breath. You want us to win, don't you? So why don't you dash? Free Kugel pulsed hotly, magic flaring out from the blade. That might be part of Dagon's spine. No, don't think about that right now, dash, warningly. Balthus and Holst both vaulted backward to get out of range. Dimitri skidded to a halt and grabbed Claude's arm to stall him as well. Just hold still. Apocalypse burst out from the blade as Hilda swung down. In a few split seconds Achilles backflipped twice away from her, dropped down on one knee and flipped his free Kugel upside down so the wide and flat side of the axe was protecting his face. Magic burst from the stone in his, and as blazing flame engulfed the entire square, Dimitri just barely saw darker fire leap out against Hilda's attack before he had to shield his eyes. The wave of heat that slammed into the three of them was a physical force. Dimitri felt the ground crunch under his feet as he's pushed back, his arms over his face. Blazing flames, he gasped, grateful that the magical fire didn't emit smoke. Hilda, aren't you worried about burning up the air? Not sure we've got a choice. Claude gritted out grimly. Considering their orders, there's a good chance the elites will be using them either way. The flames burned out a few seconds later. Achilles stood up, to the screams of horror and fear from onlookers. He's seemingly not severely injured, and smiled as Holst and Balthus promptly rejoined Hilda at her sides. The world will never give you anything easily, my Hilda, the ancient warrior said chidingly. You'll always have to fight for it, in one way or another. So never stop struggling, all right. Byleth bolted right past them, sword of the creator springing open. Achilles saw her coming out of the corner of his eye and brings up free Kugel in time to keep her from slicing his neck open, though Dimitri isn't sure how much that would do. The fact that the War Master felt it prudent to block the blow was encouraging. Professor! Hilda cheered in relief. The other members of the army nearby shout out in relief and renewed determination. Byleth winds the blade around Achilles' weapon and flings it to the side. Since he stubbornly refuses to let go, the undead War Master finds himself flung into and through the wall of a building. Haven't I told you that you can use my name by now? Byleth asked, sounding a little bemused on top of very intense relief. Hey, I've been calling you Professor this whole time. It's not easy to break the habit in public. Hilda responded. The wall crumbled as Achilles stumbled out of the broken building, grumbling and brushing chunks of stone and steel off of his shoulders. Suthies? He asked a little haltingly, staring heavily at Byleth as he stepped free of his tomb. Suthies is conserving her strength in case of an emergency. I'm afraid you don't quite qualify at the moment. Byleth responded firmly, snapping her sword back into its blade form. Hilda and Balthus both took point on either side of her. Right now you're fighting me. Achilles paused, and then he let out a decidedly rueful-sounding chuckle. Very well. This feels wrong that I should do this, you who bear the heart of the murdered goddess. I should step aside or kneel at your feet, but I cannot lay down my axe. Would that I know. Byleth said. Her eyes flashed with intense light. I know what has become of you and your fellows. I know the man who ruled the world is kept somewhere below us, and if I could, I would have it he never rises as you have. I know you are meant to stop me, so I'm going to remove you from the equation. Achilles laughed in amazement as she bolted towards him. Bold and bright and frank, I like you. Free Kugel met the sword of the creator in an enormous crash of power, nearly knocking Dimitri off his feet. Holst grabbed an axe of black metal off of a fallen Agarthan War Master and briefly turned to Dimitri and Claude as Hilda and Balthus charged as well. You two should go find another elite to tangle with, he said urgently. Are you sure? Claude asked, staring at Byleth anxiously. He was just juggling the three of you. With Byleth here, I think we'll be fine. Holst responded with a small, but sharp little smile. But the others are spread out and the saints can't be everywhere at once. Felix and Bernadetta were leading bladed off that way. He quickly pointed to roughly northeast of the circular floor. While I saw Sylvain, Ingrid, and Raphael following Daphne up straight north. I bet if you run far enough in either direction, they won't be hard to find. I haven't seen any of the other elites except Dominic up in the air, so keep an eye out for them, please hurry. Without another word, Holst bolted forward into the frantic whirlwind of energy that was Byleth's battle against Achilles. With her help, Hilda and Balthus were visibly pushing him back 1 inch at a time rather than being juggled. Claude visibly squirmed, looking at his loved ones and glancing in the directions his friends had vanished. "I hate this, I really hate this," he grumbled in order to not sound panicky. "We're gonna have to split up." "No," Dmitri protested, his heart seizing in fear at the thought. "They're not able to speak instantly, because a couple of snipers have joined the fray." Claude quickly runs forward to shoot down one up on the rooftops. While he did that, Dmitri used debris and a short build-up of momentum to take a few running jumps up onto a rooftop. Then he was able to charge at the two snipers aiming at Byleth and Hilda, cut one down and send the other flying off in a different direction. He lands with a violent thump right on top of a sword's master, effectively stunning both of them. Aisling popped out of gracious nowhere and stabbed both of them, finishing the job for him as he jumped down. There's a great rumbling in the room. Dmitri looks up at the ceiling/floor of level 2 warily. Chunks of steel and stone are still crumbling down from the yawning opening, landing with thundering crashes. He can taste ozone in the air from multiple people casting bolting. Underground, where the envy ornament is completely artificial, it makes his nerves dance. Could they actually shake Shamhala apart, and unwittingly cause the city to collapse with them and Agartha alike still trapped inside? "I know I don't know a whole lot about the stuff Suthis gave these people way back when," Aisling commented when Dmitri joined him. There was a mage standing by a street corner taking aim at her. Before he could even warn her, the younger girl strung 2 arrows and shot him down without even looking in his direction. But those sounds do not sound like good sounds. "Call it a hunch, but I think we're cutting this a bit fine." "You stole the words straight from my mouth," Dmitri admitted sourly, looking back and forth. "Where's Dash?" "Right here," Atra said, causing him to jump and whirl around with one hand reaching for his short spear. The black-haired swordswoman had appeared out of gracious nowhere thanks to Yuri. Her eyes are blazing with determination, and she's holding what looks like a black rectangle in her hand. "Sorry, it took me longer than I expected to get a hold of one of these." "What is it?" Claude asked urgently as he joined them. He quickly herded them to a house and just inside the roof over the doorway, hiding them from sight so they could have a moment to talk despite the chaos of battle all around them. "It's a communicator," Atra explained breathlessly. There's an edge of battle fever in her voice, a sort of fierceness Dmitri had only heard when she had been helping plan Edelgard's defeat. "It's another one of the Magitech toys that the army commanders have access to, and I managed to swipe this one off of a general's aide. Meaning I can talk to important people all across this floor. I'd love to beg you to explain how that works, but we don't have the time," Claude admitted. "Who are you, and what have you done with Key?" Aisling said teasingly. Dmitri was almost impressed that she could maintain an upbeat determination despite how dire this situation is. He wonders if she fully understood what kind of enemy she's facing, but she had also quite clearly demonstrated that she was not a fool of a warrior. "Haha, you're very funny AI, Claude responded with a brief moment of good-natured grumbling. It briefly brings light and warmth back into his face, which Dmitri cherished. "Anyway, this is what you were talking about?" "About being able to think of a few places." Atra nodded sharply. "Yes. I wanted this comm specifically because it's the only one that's connected to Thales's watchers. In other words, the guys who are relaying to him how badly he's losing and will carry out the order to blow up the entire world," Yuri concluded sourly. "Won't they know your voice?" Dmitri asked, thinking there was an obvious flaw in this plan. Thales's secret police recognize the voice of a random levy who hasn't been talked about since she went rogue. Atra responded mildly. She shook her head. "No, none of them would know me. Plus Yuri was able to get the 2 codes out of the man we swiped this off of. It'll require a bit of care, but I should be able to get them to talk to me and provide a location. Now, this'll only be to get me the necessary clearance cards. Hopefully it'll only take me a few minutes. Then we've gotten to the hard part. Finding the hidden walls and doors Ren spoke of, Dmitri concluded. They're a floor down, but the elites are everywhere. We have to fight them off first. Which gives Thales more time to prime the javelins, Yuri countered sharply. He was looking around warily at the occasional shaking and the rubble falling from the ceilings. McCule's falcon dragon form wasn't visible from their position. Had he also noticed the trembling and reverted to human despite still fighting? I really don't like this damn shaking. Obviously I can't say for certain, but I feel in my gut that this city wasn't built to take the kind of abuse it's been getting while underground. If something critical gives way, we'll all get buried alive." "You think so?" Aisling asked, alarm flickering across her face. "It's possible," Atra said. Her expression was both terrified and pained at the thought. She shakes her head fiercely. "Shamhala has always required careful upkeeping. If enough breaks, the floors, the walls, there's earth pressing in on the walls around and above us. It will come pouring in. So we don't let that happen," Dmitri said fiercely. He briefly looked out, searching for bolting and meteor. A few seconds later, he saw a telltale red rock come crashing down on the floor. "The biggest dangers with this in mind is probably Angel Lamine, along with Griffith Gautier and Elizabeth Daphne if their copy relics have access to the ruined sky and burning quake arts. If they're fighting the Geese the way Ren and Julius were, perhaps we can force them to retreat if we do enough damage to them. Then we need to get across to the other side of the city, Yuri Tsked. In that case, Atra, call our friends up. Let's find a route to kill two birds with one stone." Atra nodded fiercely, flipping the box-like device open and hitting a button. She raised it to her ear and pressed off to the side of the alcove, one hand over her other ear to block off some of the noise. With her trying to reach their target, Dmitri tugged Claude over and met those green eyes, which immediately became stubborn upon meeting his. He already knew. "Lovely. Claude, these are the elites. I can't have both you and Byleth out of my sight, I can't think straight without." Dmitri hissed the words out desperately, scrabbling for words to explain how certain he is that he'll be fatally distracted, how he couldn't keep the red at bay on his own, not when Thales was merely 2 floors away. "We don't have a choice. What if some of our friends die because they didn't have backup from a carrier of dragon's blood?" Claude responded lowly. He looked frustrated, and Dmitri isn't sure what's getting to him the most. All of the elites are armed with something that makes them practically a god of war. They're stronger than us, more skilled than us. "Dmitri, please, don't make me argue with you." "Not now." Dmitri choked on a dozen half-angry, half-desperate words and is forced to swallow hard. "I can't breathe when I don't know if you're alive," he admitted in with a ragged sound. "You saw me in the Holy Tomb, remember? I've done worse. Felix knows so." "This is about the boar, isn't it?" Claude asked. Something flashed across his eyes. "I thought I told him to stop calling you that." "You don't understand, he was right. What he saw that day, when we were sent out to quell a rebellion in the wake of my father's death, boar was a good name for it," Dmitri admitted bluntly, which causes those emerald green eyes to widen in shock. "You, Byleth, are friends. There's a monster inside me, Key. A monster I've only been able to fight at your side. If I let go here, I might run to my death, trying to get past the elites to reach Thales. I might let my fighting style break down and make critical mistakes. I might take risks that cause other people to die." "Dmitri," Claude looked troubled. Then he crossed the distance between them and kissed him, startled but desperately grateful. Dmitri wrapped him in his arms and returned it fiercely for a few precious seconds before they parted. "I'm not gonna die in a place like this. There's too much left that I need to do, and come back to. I trust you, Mitya. You're stronger than you think you are, you know that? Few men would cry for someone who has done them as much pain as she did, but you did without reservation. Monsters don't cry, Mitya. You can do this. You give me more credit than I deserve." "No, Key's right." Dmitri nearly jumped out of his skin when Aisling joined their whispered conversation. Claude gave her an indignant look she ignored with what looked like long practice. "Anarchy, all warriors have a monster in them, all of us can hear Ash's whispers. As long as you know of it and chose not to be ruled by it, you'll never lose your way so much that you can't return." "I've failed before," Dmitri whispered, not knowing what to do with the confident look in her eyes. "We all fail sometimes. You are still yourself, because you refuse to be mastered," Aisling responded confidently. "So trust yourself and let's go. Now." The young king looked at her in awe, wondering how she could make it sound so simple, and yet, comforting, too. There was a rare look of seriousness in her eyes, For a girl who had maintained her mischievous and gadfly's sense of humor even deep in battle, he could see in her eyes that she believed every word she'd said. "Very well," he said, breathing out. He blinked, aware of the red bleeding in and out of the corners of his vision, the fear for those he loved and couldn't see, the hatred of the man who'd taken so much from them, who was finally within reach, but no. He couldn't lose control here, he wouldn't. "When did you get so wise, AI?" Claude asked teasingly, breaking up the atmosphere. Aisling jolted and whirled on him, saying something very angry at him in their native tongue and moving to bop him on the head, which he dodged. Dmitri glanced at Atra. She was now standing ramrod straight, speaking animatedly in the sharp, cutting words of underground's language. Her expression was tight, nervous, certainly, even though it didn't show in her voice at all. A few seconds later, she snapped the device shut, that manic determination flaring in her eyes again. "I've got it. I'm headed northeast, and Bladed's that way. Dmitri, please come with me, you're the only one who can match his strength." Dmitri closed his eyes for a second, breathed in and out, and nodded. "I know. Lead the way. I'll go and see if we can shoot down Dominic," Claude added, drawing back Failnot's bowstring. "If we can't pull that off, we'll go hunting for La Mine. Be careful." "Only if you are," Yuri responded seriously. There's a warmth in his violet eyes that was usually so carefully controlled, seen in brief flashes whenever openly admitted, but now raw and concerned. "You three have come too far to die here. Don't you dare stop now." "Same goes for you," Claude said with as much cheer as he could muster. Then he and Aisling disappeared down the road. Dmitri watched them leave, his heart thudding erratically and the haze of red washing across his eyes briefly. Then Atra grabbed his wrist. He turned to her, saw her smile a little weakly before warning him, "This will feel a little uncomfortable," as Yuri placed a hand on both their shoulders. He managed a dry "no, really," before the two of them were wrenched through space. Yuri teleported them across the floor 3 times before they got close to the critical location, and it was a sign of how many times the Ashen Wolf had been throwing them all around battlefields for the past few months that Dmitri only partially wanted to throw up his guts. As soon as their feet hit the ground, Yuri's crest activated, spreading invisibility over himself and then Dmitri when he grabbed the young king's arm. "Don't let go," Yuri warned him as Atra pulled her hood up. The fabric was big enough to shadow her face. "Or else I won't be able to keep covering you like this." "Noted," Dmitri promised. Atra darted ahead, and the two of them kept up after her, avoiding stepping on or kicking anything that would indicate their presence. It occurred to him in that moment that while all of the elites were here, but there was no sign of the apostles. Judging by how similar their relics looked to the weapons Agartha had forged from Nabatean bone and blood, they were likely made under similar circumstances, so why weren't they here? Had the apostles just managed to avoid dying in a place where the underground people could collect their bodies from? Wool gathering. It's something for Claude to chase after when this nightmare is finally over. Yuri's pace was quick and light-footed. Dmitri had to pay a little attention in order to keep matching his pace. "I think it will take all of us sitting on him to keep him from running off looking for stories. And Rodrigue might need to talk me out of going along with it." They trotted warily through the back streets. There was a smoking ruin of a Titanus abandoned on the street, forcing them to climb over it in order to keep up with Atra. There were strangely few people along this road. He could see occasional civilians peering out from their windows, but even they were few and far in between. He imagines that seeing them this far down into the city must be terrifying. Yuri paused when Atra ran up to a wall, tapping on one of those glowing boxes again. He glanced over his shoulder, brow furrowed as he looked for something. "What is it?" Dmitri asked. "We've got some sort of mouse following us," Yuri said with a frown. "I keep seeing them out of the corner of my eye, but they skitter away before I can see them fully." A mouse? Did he mean a child? Surely no one would allow them to be roaming about in the middle of an active war zone. But Thales deploys children as soldiers, children barely old enough to know right from wrong. His father's voice growled deep in Dmitri's mind. What's one more monstrous crime from him at this point than demanding the children fight as well? "Do you think we can scare them into a house? There are too many ways to get stepped on out here." Yuri started to say something, only to curse when Atra pressed a button and the wall she was standing in front of opened up, revealing a ladder and a raised platform partially hidden from view. The young renegade jumped up and grabbed the rungs, climbing up smoothly. "What if we had a moment? We can't mess this up." Dimitri's heart squirmed, even though he knows Yuri is right. He glanced over his shoulder as the violet-haired teen prepared to warp them, searching for the mouse. He saw a dark, small figure in a hood dart out from around a corner seconds before the teleportation pulled him onward. The young king barely managed to swallow off a don't that would have given them away when they land on the hidden walkway. Shaking his head, Dimitri looked about. There are hard walls between them and the floor where the battle is ongoing, with what Atra called one-way windows permitting those inside to view the floor ahead of them. Dimitri saw a black wyvern get hit by a glowing arrow and drop low to the floor, but didn't collapse. He's surprised that an undead flyer would be able to take more abuse than a living one, rather than less. Of course, he shouldn't be surprised that Jason Dominic's mount would be almost as durable as he or his comrades were. Focus. Atra was running up to a dark, cloaked figure looking through one of the one-way windows. She skidded to a halt in front of them and bowed, rattling off something he doesn't understand. I must try and learn their words, at least enough to hold part of a conversation. Afterward, well. She was buying them time to get close. The spy sounded irritated when he spoke back to her, and altogether far too calm for how deeply they'd breached. Dimitri wondered if that was confidence or arrogance, or both. Atra slightly moved one hand behind her leg as she spoke animatedly. The spy resisted for a minute before reiterating something, and pulling out a comm box. Atra slashed sharply with her fingers. This is one of them. Yuri moved in a flash, teleporting, and ramming his sword through the man's back just like he did to Solon. Dimitri hurried over and snacked the comm box. He grimaced slightly then slammed his clenched fist into it with all his might. The box crumbled instantly, no sound being able to pass on. He hissed as metal dug into his hands. He shook his fist out, grimacing ruefully at his damaged gauntlets as Atra dropped to her knees and began furiously searching for what she needed. "Let me look at that, just in case." "You didn't feel a shock, like getting hit by a low-powered thunder?" Yuri questioned, taking his hand and examining it. He cast a quick heel. "No, I didn't," Dimitri said. "Perhaps it's because of that day years ago. I've always been slow to react to pain since then." If Yuri hadn't commented on it, he probably would have noticed that little shift in the darkness behind him. The figure is hiding behind a crook in the wall. She's small. Too small to be out in this. "Come out of there, you're going to get yourself killed," Dimitri said, loudly and chidingly, making Atra and the small figure start. He worried the acknowledgement would make them try and flee, and Yuri tensed up to teleport after them. Instead, after a moment of indecision, a familiar small frame darted out of the darkness and kicked him in the shin. Not hard enough to do him any harm through his armor, but it would leave a nice bruise, thanks to the augmentation she'd gone through. "That's rich coming from you sun dreamer," Marion said, a voice that sounded like she couldn't choose between a shriek and a hiss. Yuri's posture slackened, even as he gave her a look that screamed I should have known. "You're the one going picking fights with the Einherjar. And what do you suggest we do instead, little Miss Escape Artist?" Yuri responded a little dryly. Marion glared at him. "Okay, I know you've been trained to be a tiny assassin, but you look about as intimidating as a kitten with its fur fluffed up. What are you doing out here?" Atra asked incredulously, shooting up and grabbing Marion by the arm before the girl could dart out of the way. "Mercedes is going to lose years off her life if she finds you out here, you know that." Well, she's out here too, so she doesn't have room to talk," Marion said, her tone stubbornly rebellious despite how her voice cracked. "You're acting like this is business as usual, but it's not. The Einherjar, they're going to rip her apart, and you too. Why are all of you like this? Why won't you accept the inevitable? Why are all of you so ready to die?" Dimitri looked at her, remembering the sharp-eyed, angry girl who'd come to assassinate him when he lay sleeping. He wondered what if it was like, growing up in a world without wind or ocean or green, being told every day that it was stolen from you. At one point he wouldn't have been able to see past that shield of learned contempt and anger, but now he can see the fear underneath. The confusion. The uncertainty that he'd managed to plant in her coming full circle. That's because, Atra started, pausing furiously as she looked for words she needed. Dmitri tapped her shoulder and gave it a go himself. Are you looking for your grandmother and Mercedes, Marion? He asked gently. Marion looked at him like he'd just hit her with Thoron. She stared at him for an incredibly long moment before stammering something incoherent. Then, why, yes, Shamhala is, the city is, she babbled, so tightly taut that she can't put what's happening to words. Everything she was feeling is in her raw, fearful, and determined gray eyes. Dmitri sighed and knelt down in front of her. I'll try to help you, Marion. He said quietly. I don't dare send you back, not out into that, but if I have a moment to breathe, I'll help you find them both. The preteen girl blinked furiously. She was trying to keep tears away, staring at him through narrowed eyes as she tried to keep control. But why? She asked. Because we're the same, you and I. Dmitri responded, tucking stray strands of hair behind her ear. We went to war for the sake of those we loved. She simply stared at him at that declaration, her eyes so wide it was as if she had just been gifted the secrets of the universe. Now stay close to me, it's going to be very dangerous going from here. Marion swallowed. Okay. I brought this. She unsheathed a familiar black blade. Dmitri somewhat bleakly wondered where she'd managed to find one of those. If I can help. SHH. Only use that if you have to protect yourself. Until that comes to pass, let us protect you. Atra said as Dmitri straightened up. Now get ready to run. Blade wasn't hard to find. Dmitri landed on the ground after leaving the far end of the hidden passageway to see and feel the energy explosion from two relics rushing outward from two battling foes. His ancestor is directly ahead of him, sending Felix skidding backward into a building wall before backflipping away from Bernadetta's arrows. Sirios wasn't there, he noted with an immense jolt of concern. The only reason he could imagine her being gone was if they told her that somewhere else needed her support. Glenn was still there, meeting Blade a few blows at a time before scrambling out of the way, giving Felix and Bernadetta a chance to get up and get their bearings. Dmitri was starting to run toward the group, his voice raised to draw his ancestor's attention, when a loud Michael cut across the floor. It made Marion wince and look around wildly in the moments before Indek dropped down from a balcony and landed in between Bernadetta and Michael, who had reoriented to face him. Indek, his ancestor acknowledged, a shiver going through his otherwise stalwart posture. And, you're Dmitri, aren't you? He glanced Dmitri's way. The young king instinctively pushed Marion behind him, lifting Eridbar off his back. That's my name. He acknowledged. Michael dodged around a flurry of arrows from Bernadetta. Dmitri, he echoed the name before twisting between Glenn and Felix, swinging his lance to block their swords each in turn and force his way between them. Indek takes aim at him again and he dropped to the ground in an instant to avoid them. I'm sorry about our encounter on the island. I'm sorry too. About Maurice. Dmitri nudged Marion back pointedly so Yuri can grab her and turn invisible. Then he darted forward to join the fight. I'm not. The tightness in that undead voice, the repressed anguish Michael didn't think he was allowed to feel, was so familiar. Dmitri wondered, with a shiver, how much difference there really was between them. I'm glad his 1,000 years of a living hell has finally come to an end. I'm glad he isn't suffering anymore. I've had to cut the throats of people that I cared about before, that you took that burden from me is more than I deserve. He whirled and threw a spear at Dmitri, blindingly fast. Dmitri dodged and pulled Atra aside, she threw a wave of fire at him from her sword, which he dodged in turn. So fast. I wish that things had been different, but wishes are words. Michael said, slamming Eridbar into the ground. The explosion of magic power caused all of them to be shoved multiple feet backwards, their knees buckling under the physical force. Well, all of them except for one. Indek had faced this many times, after all. If words are easy, then spare some for me. Indek half demanded, half pleaded, there's a weight in his voice that Dmitri hadn't heard before. A peek into how his ancient friend had carried himself when he was openly called a saint. I want more than those 2 words that were the only thing you ever spoke to me. He fired a number of arrows aimed for the Revenant's arms, probably to try pinning him to a building. Would that work with Michael's strength? What else was there for me to say? That in the end, I was just another cannibal. Michael said, his voice snapping on the words, "There's old pain there, so old and running so deep." Dimitri charged at him and swung Eridbar, briefly forcing him to look away from Glenn and Felix to block it. Michael still found a way out, his eyes flicking to the side for a second before kicking Felix's leg, forcing him down so he could duck under Glenn's strike. There were lots of cannibals back then. Bernadetta squeaked out, somehow audible above the general chaos. "Oh yes there were, little one, did they not tell you the tales to frighten you toward riousness?" Michael growled, his eyes beginning to glow with magic light. "Human evils are always so grotesque, aren't they? Hresvelg, Thales, Maurice, and I, we drank blood for power, and became so much less. Isn't it a laugh? Human superiority." He swung his Eridbar in a wide circle before driving it down into the ground. The explosion of magic tore the whole street apart. Atra caught Dimitri before he could face-plant into a pile of rubble, letting him get his balance back. "I want you to tell me one thing plain, so I can finally sleep without nightmares." Indek all but screamed back. No, he was screaming, his green-gold eyes wilder than Dimitri had ever seen them. "Vishnu told me about you, Michael." The Revenant froze in place, stock still, red eyes growing incredibly wide. No. Yes. It's the truth. He came back with a smile, gazing off into the sky, and laughed when Herod ribbed him over dreaming of a prince. Indek belted the words out like crossbow bolts, planting his feet on the ground and drawing, but not firing. "But that's..." Michael was so distracted by these words that Glenn was almost able to slam his sword into his face. Dimitri's ancestor responded violently, slugging the older Frildarius in the chest after taking the sacred blade into the shoulder. Glenn went flying backwards, and Atra rushed to heal what is probably a couple broken bones judging by how he struggled to move. Michael's eyes are wild, like wanted to flee, but Dimitri blocked off one end of the alley while Felix and Bernadetta took the other. He could get up onto a roof easily with his enhanced strength and lack of pain, but he'd have to get around Indeka's arrows. How could there be so much emotion in someone who was undead? "He said he cared about you. He said he wanted to invite you to the canyon but couldn't find the words." Indek said so desperately. "I knew and you weren't there the night Nemesis came to the canyon, but by my mother's soul, tell me. Did you know?" The Revenant doesn't answer, but Dimitri can see turmoil burning in his eyes like the fires of Alel. "Tell me. Maurice told me when he was dying that he hadn't known. Did you? Did any of you? Tell me, please." Indek demanded, screamed, and Dimitri felt like a voyeur just for being present. "Of course I didn't," Michael shouted back, his voice cracking with agony. "He was the only man I ever loved." Judging by how Indeka's eyes widened, even he hadn't expected that response. Felix, Glenn, and Atra's expressions would be comical in literally any other situation. Dimitri would admit to being completely flat-footed himself, though as the shock sank in, he felt a dawning wave of sorrow. "I loved him," Michael repeated, gritting his teeth. "I missed the sign. That story, I didn't realize in time. Too late. Always too late." "Michael," Indek whispered. "You are wasting time here." Michael wheezed, stepping backward and clutching the shoulder the sword of Merlta had dug so deeply into. It very clearly wasn't debilitating, his posture was straight, that arm was still moving easily and hadn't lost much strength, but the way he flicked his lance, he was taking what chance he could find to stall. "You need to get downstairs, and get to the javelins, then kill every member of that council. They all have the keys to the cataclysm." Then he was gone in a flash of rewarp. "As much as I very much want to sit down and process that," Dimitri said, musing that he may be quoting Claude word for word from an earlier point in time. "He's right. Yuri." "I'm right here," Yuri said, reappearing with Marion. Her eyes were as wide as dinner plates. Clearly, she had heard every part of that exchange. "Good." Dimitri breathed out. "Indek, please, go and find who nearest needs your help. We'll secure a route to an emergency elevator and hold it until Byleth and Claude can catch up." Once they're here, Yuri and Atra will show them the way and we'll get back to helping you with the elites. Index screwed his eyes shut for a moment, then opened them again with a shuddering breath. You're right. Glenn, are you alright? Yeah, I'm fine. Glenn rasped, getting up and picking up his sword. Atra isn't hovering, so Dmitri relaxed in relief. Let's go, I'll go with you. Time was of the essence, after all. Check the description for the links to the author.